My father handed me the deed to a rotting fishing camp in the freezing Minnesota wilderness, while my brother received a $4 million luxury estate in Los Angeles. Years later, when my mother discovered the absolute fortune I had built from those ruins, she called me with a chilling demand. "You have 96 hours to pack your things and give this property back to us so your brother can clear his debts." When my brother arrived to physically force me out, his arrogant smirk vanished the second he pulled up to my private security gates. What he found waiting for him completely destroyed the toxic hierarchy of our family. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever turned a family insult into an absolute empire. My name is Lauren. I am 34 years old, and I work as a boutique hospitality developer. I stood in the soaring glass-walled lobby of my exclusive eco-resort, known to the world as the Aurora Haven. The morning sun reflected off the pristine frozen lake outside, casting long, elegant shadows across the polished stone floors. A massive stone fireplace crackled in the center of the room, warming the high-net-worth guests who were quietly enjoying their artisan coffee and locally sourced breakfasts. I was reviewing our quarterly revenue reports on my tablet, feeling a deep and quiet sense of accomplishment. My property commanded $2,500 a night, and we were booked completely solid for the next 2 years. I had created a sanctuary that catered to tech executives and celebrities seeking absolute privacy. Then my phone buzzed in my pocket, breaking my peaceful concentration. The caller identification displayed my mother, Cynthia. I took a deep breath, bracing myself for the usual passive-aggressive remarks, and answered the call. Lauren, her voice was sharp and entirely devoid of warmth. "Harrison's venture in Los Angeles did not pan out. We are stepping in to fix his situation. You have 96 hours to pack your things and give the Minnesota property back to us. Your brother will take over the land to clear his debts." I stared out at the snow-covered pine trees, processing the sheer audacity of her words. There was no greeting. She did not ask how my day was or how I was doing. It was just a cold calculation that whatever I possessed automatically belonged to my older brother the moment he needed it. Harrison had squandered millions, and my mother expected me to simply hand over my livelihood to save him from his own incompetence. She spoke as if I were merely holding the property in storage for him, as if my ownership was a temporary mistake that needed correcting by the real adults in the family. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice or try to explain the absurdity of her demand. My heart beat with a steady, calm rhythm born of years of emotional distance. I simply took a slow sip of my espresso and replied, "You cannot take what you do not own." I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket, letting the silence of the lobby wash over me. As I walked across the room, greeting my staff and checking the pristine condition of the dining area, my mind drifted back to 3 years ago. The air in the lawyer's office had been stifling and heavy with unresolved tension. My father, Richard, had recently passed away, leaving behind a legacy of outdated gender roles and blatant favoritism. Growing up in our wealthy California neighborhood, I was taught early on that my role was to be quiet and supportive, while Harrison was groomed for greatness. My father had always made it clear that real business was a masculine pursuit, and that my older brother was his natural successor. I spent my youth achieving top grades and quietly building my career in commercial development, but nothing I did ever earned a nod of approval from the man sitting at the head of our dining table. I sat across the polished mahogany table from my mother and brother, listening as the lawyer read my father's final wishes. Harrison received the luxury estate in Los Angeles, valued at over $4.2 million, along with all the liquid assets and lucrative investment portfolios. My brother, who was 31 at the time, slouched in his leather chair, barely containing his smug satisfaction. He had never worked a hard day in his life, bouncing from one failed startup to another, always bailed out by our father when the bills came due. Then came my inheritance. The lawyer handed me a yellowing deed to a derelict 1940s fishing camp on the north shore of Minnesota. It had been abandoned for decades. The paperwork indicated the roof of the main lodge was caving in, the plumbing was non-existent, and the property was largely considered a worthless liability. My mother Cynthia leaned over and placed a perfectly manicured hand on my arm. Her tone dripped with condescension. "Your brother needs the capital for his real estate investments, Lauren. You have always liked the quiet. Do not be ungrateful. Accept what your father gave you." Harrison chuckled under his breath, muttering something about me finally having a place to hide away from the real world. I looked at the faded property map attached to the deed. I did not argue or complain about the blatant inequality. I accepted the insult with a tight, polite smile. While they saw a rotting swamp shack, my professional background allowed me to see something they completely missed. I knew that reacting emotionally would only give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. They wanted me to feel small, but I only felt a cold, sharp clarity taking root in my mind. A week after that humiliating will reading, I flew to Minnesota and drove 3 hours into the dense wilderness to see my inheritance in person. The journey was long, and the frozen roads were treacherous, but I needed to lay my own eyes on the land. The reality was visually grim, just as the lawyer had described. The wooden cabins were collapsing under the weight of heavy snowfall, and the main lodge was completely unsalvageable. The wind howled off the massive lake, cutting through my winter coat and biting at my skin. My phone buzzed constantly with text messages from my family back in California. Harrison sent a photo of himself lounging by the pool at his new estate, with a caption asking if I had contracted tetanus yet, from my pile of firewood. They reveled in the idea that my father had put me in my place, cementing Harrison as the only true business mind in the family. But as I walked the perimeter of the property, stepping over fallen branches and debris, I felt a surge of absolute adrenaline. The fishing camp sat on miles of untouched private shoreline, bordering a heavily protected state park. The views of the dark water and the surrounding evergreen forest were breathtaking. More importantly, I had spent hours digging through county records before my flight. The land retained a rare grandfathered commercial zoning status that was virtually impossible to obtain in that strictly regulated environmental district today. It was a literal gold mine disguised as a frozen wasteland. I stood on the icy shore looking out at the vast expanse of the lake, visualizing the future. I knew exactly what I was going to do. I was going to build a sanctuary so exclusive and luxurious that people would travel from across the globe just to experience it. I saw glass walls framing the forest, modern amenities blending with the rugged terrain, and a standard of hospitality that rivaled the finest hotels in the world. And I was going to do it completely on my own, without a single dime or word of encouragement from the family that had discarded me. They had handed me ruins, expecting me to fail and disappear into obscurity. They had no idea they had just handed me the foundation of an empire. I did not pick up a hammer. That was the mistake my family assumed I would make. They pictured me in dirty overalls trying to patch a leaking roof on a worthless shack, hoping to carve out a pathetic little existence in the woods. But I am a hospitality developer. I build experiences and I structure deals. My first move was completely invisible to them. I flew back to California just long enough to pack up my life and meet with my most trusted industry contacts. I sat in a high-rise boardroom across from a commercial lender who specialized in luxury real estate. I slid the zoning documents and my comprehensive business plan across the table. When he saw the grandfathered commercial status on pristine state park adjacent shoreline, his eyes widened. I walked out of that building with an 8-figure commercial development loan. But money was only the first step. Protection was the second. I knew my mother and Harrison. If they ever caught a glimpse of my success, they would find a way to claw their way into it, claiming family rights or father's legacy. I hired a specialized asset protection attorney. We transferred the Minnesota property out of my personal name and into a newly formed irrevocable trust. The operational entity was registered as Northern Lights Holdings, a limited liability company carefully structured in a state with strict corporate privacy laws. If anyone searched the county tax registries, my name simply did not exist. I was a ghost operating a shadow empire. With the funding secured and my legal armor in place, the real war began. Minnesota winters are unforgiving, and building a luxury off-grid eco-resort in the middle of nowhere tested every ounce of my professional expertise. I rented a modest apartment in Duluth, making the brutal drive to the site daily. I hired a renowned architectural firm to design 12 standalone glass cabins that hovered over the tree line, offering unobstructed views of the Aurora Borealis. The logistics were an absolute nightmare. We faced aggressive supply chain shortages for the specialized triple-pane thermal glass imported from Europe. A freak blizzard shut down the main access road for 3 straight weeks, stalling our foundation pours. Local contractors threatened to walk off the job when the temperatures dropped below zero. I handled it exactly as my father always claimed a woman could not. I negotiated aggressively. I restructured the construction timelines. I sourced alternative luxury materials domestically when international shipping failed. I managed multi-million-dollar crisis events daily from a makeshift office in a construction trailer wearing a heavy parka and drinking cheap coffee. I was exhausted to the bone, but I had never felt more alive. Every solved problem was another brick in the wall, separating me from my family's toxic expectations. 2 years of relentless grind culminated in a silent, highly calculated launch. I did not run digital ads or launch flashy social media campaigns. The Aurora Haven was designed for people who valued absolute discretion. Through my network, I offered the entire property for a private corporate retreat to a major technology firm. They were blown away by the execution. The raw natural beauty of the frozen lake, paired with heated floors, personalized butler service, and a dining room run by a chef I had poached from a top-tier restaurant in Chicago, created an unforgettable contrast. Word of mouth among the elite is the most powerful marketing tool on earth. Within 3 months, we were turning away reservations. At $2,500 a night per cabin, with a minimum 3-night stay, the revenue figures quickly surpassed even my most aggressive projections. Tech executives, celebrities seeking a digital detox, and high-net-worth individuals seeking refuge from the public eye booked our property solid. My corporate accounts swelled. I was quietly accumulating wealth that eclipsed the liquid assets my father had handed over to Harrison, and I did it all without compromising my peace or answering to anyone. The irony was staggering. While I was hosting billionaires and finalizing expansion plans, my personal phone would occasionally light up with reminders of the delusional world my family lived in. Harrison loved to send unprompted photos of his supposedly glamorous life. I would be sitting in my executive office reviewing profit margins, and a picture would arrive showing Harrison holding a bottle of champagne at a crowded Los Angeles pool party. His text messages were predictably arrogant. "Just closed another week of networking," he would write. "How are the mosquitoes in your swamp shack treating you?" My mother, Cynthia, was equally insufferable. She sent sporadic, condescending messages checking in on my mental health. She loved to play the concerned parent from a distance, asking if I had managed to install indoor plumbing yet, or if I needed her to send me a small check for winter boots. She would remind me how proud my father would be of Harrison for keeping the Los Angeles estate so pristine while lamenting my stubbornness. I read their messages while sipping expensive wine, looking out over a property worth more than their entire combined net worth. I never took the bait. I never sent a photo of my glass cabins or my crowded reservation books. I responded with short, non-committal texts. Just staying busy, I would type, or enjoying the quiet. I let them construct their own reality, where I was the pathetic outcast freezing in the woods. Their underestimation was my greatest shield. It gave me the ultimate luxury of building my life completely undisturbed by their greed. The illusion of my family's perfect life shattered on a Tuesday afternoon. In the world of high-end real estate, the financial grapevine is remarkably small and incredibly fast. I was having lunch with a commercial broker in Chicago when he casually mentioned a spectacular default happening in Southern California. A massive Bel Air estate was entering pre-foreclosure. The owner had defaulted on 3 separate mortgages and his assets were being seized. The owner was my brother Harrison. I listened quietly as the broker detailed the spectacular financial collapse. Harrison had burned through the millions our father left him with breathtaking speed. He had funneled cash into completely unregulated crypto startups that vanished overnight. He bought luxury cars he could not afford to maintain and threw parties that rivaled movie premieres. His entire life was a hollow performance funded by an inheritance he never earned. Now the banks were calling in his debts and he was facing absolute financial ruin. I felt no pity. I simply paid the lunch bill and flew back to Minnesota. I knew exactly what was coming next. My mother, Cynthia, would never allow her golden child to face the consequences of his actions. She would look for someone else to pay the price. The barrage of voicemails began 2 days later. Cynthia did not call to check on me or to humbly ask for a favor. Her tone was as arrogant and entitled as ever. She left message after message, completely ignoring the reality of Harrison's catastrophic failures. "Lauren," she demanded in one voicemail, "your brother has hit a minor speed bump with his investments. We are restructuring the family assets to help him. I need you to surrender the deed to that Minnesota plot. We found a commercial developer who will buy the land for a fraction of its value to bail Harrison out. Pack your things and get ready to sign the transfer papers." She genuinely believed I was sitting in a freezing shack waiting for her instructions. She thought my inheritance was a shared family piggy bank ready to be smashed open the second Harrison ran out of cash. I did not return her calls. I did not text her back. I simply forwarded the voicemails to my security team and instructed them to be on high alert. When ignoring me did not work, they resorted to their favorite tactic: physical intimidation. Harrison decided to handle the situation himself. He assumed I was still the quiet, obedient sister who would fold the moment he raised his voice. He flew into the nearest regional airport and rented a luxury Jeep, intending to drive up the North Shore and physically kick me off the property. I was sitting in my executive office when the security alert pinged on my monitor. The perimeter cameras showed Harrison's rented Jeep turning off the main highway. I watched the live feed with absolute cold anticipation. He expected to find a rutted dirt road leading to a collapsing cabin. He expected to easily bully his way onto the property and force a pen into my hand. Instead, his Jeep rolled to a stop in front of a massive matte black security gate flanked by solid stone pillars. The camera captured his profound confusion. He rolled down his window and stared at the sleek brass intercom panel. My head of security, a former military contractor named David, stepped out of the heated guardhouse. He did not look like a park ranger. He wore a tailored dark suit and an earpiece projecting the kind of quiet authority that high-net-worth clients expect. Harrison demanded entry, claiming he was the owner's brother and that he was here to take over the property. David calmly requested his identification and radioed my office. "Send him through," I instructed, my voice steady. "Let him drive all the way up to the main lobby. Make sure he sees everything." The heavy gates glided open, revealing a pristine, heated driveway winding through the snow-covered pines. I watched the camera feeds as Harrison drove slowly up the mountain. His confusion was visibly transforming into disbelief. The road did not lead to a swamp shack. It opened up into a breathtaking architectural marvel. He passed the discreet valet station where luxury SUVs and imported sports cars were parked. He saw the 12 standalone glass cabins hovering elegantly over the tree line, their floor-to-ceiling windows reflecting the frozen lake and the winter sky. He parked his Jeep haphazardly near the main entrance and stepped out. The cameras caught his face as he took in the sheer scale of the Aurora Haven. He looked at the custom stonework, the ambient lighting design, and the impeccably dressed staff moving quietly across the grounds. He saw the Michelin-starred dining room visible through the main lodge windows where guests were sipping vintage wines. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The worthless land he had mocked for years was gone. In its place stood a multi-million-dollar empire. The color drained completely from his face. His jaw went slack. For a fleeting second, I saw genuine shock and humiliation in his eyes. He realized how spectacularly he had underestimated me. But that moment of clarity vanished almost instantly. As he stared at the luxury surrounding him, the shock mutated. His expression darkened, shifting into a sickening, visceral greed. He did not see my hard work. He saw his own salvation. He saw a gold mine that he believed he was entitled to claim. I walked out of my office and stood at the top of the grand staircase overlooking the lobby. Harrison burst through the heavy glass doors, bringing a gust of freezing air with him. His eyes darted wildly around the soaring lobby, taking in the massive stone fireplace, the custom furnishings, and the wealthy guests conversing quietly in the lounge areas. Finally, his gaze snapped up and locked onto me. I stood there wearing a tailored designer suit, looking down at the brother who had squandered a fortune while I was building one. I did not smile. I did not flinch. I let the silence stretch between us, forcing him to absorb the reality of the power dynamic that had just permanently shifted. Lauren. His voice echoed slightly in the expansive lobby, loud and entirely inappropriate for the setting. What is this? Whose money did you use to build this? I walked slowly down the stairs, my heels clicking against the polished stone. I stopped a few feet away from him, maintaining absolute professional composure. My money, Harrison, I replied, keeping my voice low but firm. The money I secured, the money I managed, and the empire I built while you were losing father's house to the bank. His face flushed a deep, angry red. He took a step toward me, trying to use his physical presence to intimidate me, just as he had done when we were children. But I was not a child anymore, and we were standing in my domain. You think you are so smart? He sneered. You took father's land and built a hotel. That means this is family property. Dad's will gave me the business assets. This belongs to the family. It belongs to me. He was shouting now, drawing the attention of my staff and guests. His entitlement was so deeply ingrained that he genuinely believed he could simply lay claim to my success because he shared my bloodline. He was bankrupt, desperate, and cornered, and he was trying to use the only tactic he knew, demanding that the world hand him what he wanted. I signaled to David, who immediately stepped forward, with two other security personnel flanking Harrison smoothly but firmly. You are making a scene in my lobby, Harrison, I said, my tone perfectly level. This property belongs to an irrevocable trust and a limited liability company that you have absolutely zero legal claim to. The land was deeded to me, and I transformed it. You have nothing here. He lunged forward, pointing a shaking finger at my face. You are going to sign half of this over to me today, Lauren. Mom and I already spoke to the lawyers. Dad was not of sound mind when he gave you this land. We are going to freeze your accounts and drag you through court until you give us our family equity. You owe me this. I looked at the desperate, angry man who had spent his entire life being handed everything only to lose it all. I felt no fear of his legal threats. My armor was completely impenetrable. You do not have family equity, I told him. You have a massive debt and a delusion. Escort him off the property, David. If he resists, call the local authorities and have him arrested for trespassing. Harrison screamed curses at me as my security team forced him back through the glass doors and into the freezing cold. I watched him struggle against them, his face twisted in rage as they marched him to his rented Jeep. He had come here to kick me out of a shack. Instead, he was being thrown out of my palace. The war had officially arrived at my doorstep, but I was more than ready to finish it. Harrison thought he could just call a lawyer and freeze my accounts. He genuinely believed that the legal system was a weapon he could wield against me just because our father had always paid for his mistakes. He had absolutely no idea that the war for this property was fought and won 3 years ago in boardrooms he would never be invited into. To understand why his threats meant nothing, you have to understand how I built my armor. When I returned from that initial freezing trip to Minnesota 3 years ago, I did not waste a single second feeling sorry for myself. I did not cry over my father's insulting will or my mother's condescending remarks. Instead, I walked into the sleek, high-rise office of a premier commercial lending firm in downtown Los Angeles. I did not walk in as a grieving daughter or a victim of family favoritism. I walked in as a seasoned boutique hospitality developer with a portfolio of successful boutique projects under my belt. The senior lending officer, a sharp man, sat across from me with a polite but skeptical smile. He knew my father's reputation, and he likely assumed I was there to leverage the family name for a vanity project. I did not mention my father once. Instead, I slid a thick leather-bound business plan across the polished mahogany table. I watched his eyes track over the executive summary. I had mapped out every square inch of that Minnesota property. I showed him the soil samples, the environmental impact waivers, and most importantly, the grandfathered commercial zoning status that made the land incredibly rare. I explained that the North Shore of Minnesota was a highly restricted environmental zone, making new commercial permits virtually impossible to obtain. But because the derelict fishing camp had been commercially licensed in the 1940s, that status was legally protected. I held a golden ticket to build a massive commercial enterprise on untouched, pristine wilderness. The banker's skeptical smile vanished. He leaned forward, scrutinizing the financial projections, the target demographic analysis, and the aggressive timeline I had established for the Aurora Haven. I was not asking for a small personal loan to fix a cabin roof. I requested an $18 million commercial development line of credit. I backed it up with data showing the explosive demand for ultra-luxury secluded ecotourism among high-net-worth individuals who valued absolute privacy. The bank did their own due diligence, sending appraisers and zoning experts to verify my claims. 2 weeks later, I sat in that same boardroom and signed the closing documents for the full $18 million. I had the capital. Now I needed the shield. Securing the funding was only half the battle. I knew my mother and brother better than anyone. Cynthia operated on a toxic blend of entitlement and maternal authority, while Harrison believed the world owed him endless second chances. If they ever caught a glimpse of my success, they would attempt to claw their way into it. They would claim that because the original dirt belonged to my father, the resulting empire belonged to the family. I needed to ensure that legally, my family could never touch a single dime of my revenue. I hired one of the most ruthless asset protection attorneys in California. I paid his exorbitant retainer fee up front and gave him a single clear directive. I wanted to become a ghost. I explained my family dynamic, the blatant favoritism, the history of financial entitlement, and the inevitable threat they would pose once the resort became profitable. My attorney went to work constructing a legal fortress so complex and ironclad that even a team of corporate lawyers would struggle to pierce it. First, we transferred the deed of the Minnesota land out of my personal name entirely. I surrendered direct personal ownership and placed the land into a highly secure, irrevocable trust. This meant that on paper I did not own the dirt. The trust owned it, and the trust was governed by strict fiduciary rules that explicitly excluded any claims from my immediate family members. If Harrison ever tried to sue me for the land, he would be suing a phantom. Next, we established the operational entity. We formed a limited liability company called Northern Lights Holdings. We registered the company in a state known for its impenetrable corporate privacy laws, protecting the identities of its managing members. We used third-party registered agents to handle all public-facing documentation. If my mother or brother ever decided to search the county tax registries or property records in Minnesota, my name would simply not exist. There was no public link between me and the Aurora Haven. I spent weeks signing stacks of legal covenants, operating agreements, and non-disclosure contracts. Every contractor, every supplier, and every future employee of the resort would be bound by strict confidentiality clauses. The brand identity of the resort would be heavily guarded. I was setting up a system where I could operate a multi-million-dollar hospitality empire in complete anonymity. The psychological contrast during those months was staggering. While I was sitting in sterile law offices executing complex legal maneuvers to protect my future, Harrison was publicly burning through his. I would see his social media updates popping up on my phone. He was buying depreciating assets like sports cars and throwing lavish parties at the Los Angeles estate he had inherited. He was acting like a man who had won the lottery, completely blind to the fact that wealth without structure is just a countdown to bankruptcy. I did not feel a shred of guilt as I fortified my walls. My father had taught me that business was a brutal world where only the strongest survived. He had used that philosophy to justify cutting me out and handing everything to his son. I simply took his lesson and applied it with a level of precision he never could have anticipated. I used the very tools of the corporate world he worshipped to permanently lock his favored child out of my life. With the $18 million sitting securely in the corporate accounts of Northern Lights Holdings and my legal armor fully forged, I was finally ready to break ground. I had the money. I had the protection. The only thing left to do was fly back into the freezing Minnesota winter and physically build the sanctuary that would eventually bring my toxic family to their knees. I landed in Duluth in late October just as the first serious frost hardened the ground. I did not buy a tool belt or a pair of steel-toed boots. My weapons were a satellite internet connection, a meticulously negotiated commercial contract, and a climate-controlled mobile command center I had transported to the edge of the property. While my brother was busy throwing away our father's money on cryptocurrency fads in sunny California, I was staring down a brutal Midwestern winter, ready to orchestrate the most ambitious development project of my career. The original fishing camp was beyond saving. The rot had eaten through the foundational beams, and black mold coated the interior walls. I hired a specialized demolition crew to level the structures and haul away the debris within 72 hours. Once the land was cleared, the true scale of the canvas revealed itself. Miles of untouched evergreen forest sloped dramatically down to the rocky shoreline of the massive freezing lake. To transform this rugged landscape into an ultra-luxury eco-resort, I retained a premier architectural firm based in Chicago known for blending modern minimalism with extreme off-grid sustainability. I sat at the head of a massive conference table reviewing their blueprints. My vision was uncompromising. I demanded 12 standalone cantilevered glass cabins that appeared to float above the tree line. The structures needed to offer unobstructed panoramic views of the water and the night sky, specifically engineered for guests to watch the Aurora Borealis from the comfort of a heated plush king-size bed. Every cabin had to be entirely self-sufficient, utilizing state-of-the-art geothermal heating, solar tile roofing, and advanced water purification systems. I was not just building a hotel. I was building a fortress of absolute luxury in the middle of a frozen wilderness. The architects were brilliant, but the elements were merciless. By December, the Minnesota winter hit with a ferocity I had never experienced. Temperatures plummeted below zero and the snow fell in blinding, relentless sheets. The lake froze solid, turning the landscape into a desolate expanse of white and gray. The deep freeze threatened to halt our foundation pours. Then the supply chain broke down entirely. The custom triple-pane thermal glass essential for the floor-to-ceiling windows of the cabins was delayed at a European port due to an international shipping strike. Without the glass, we could not seal the structures. Without sealed structures, the interior work could not begin. To make matters worse, the local contracting syndicate, assuming I was just a naive California heiress playing in the snow, attempted to leverage the delay. The lead foreman walked into my mobile office, tracking snow onto the floor, and casually informed me that his crew was walking off the site until spring unless I agreed to a 40% hazard pay increase for working in the sub-zero conditions. He stood there, a large, intimidating man in a heavy winter jacket, expecting me to panic. He expected me to cave, to pull out a checkbook and pay whatever ransom he demanded to keep my vanity project alive. He clearly did not understand who he was dealing with. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of frustration. I pulled out his master service agreement, flipped to Section 4, and slid it across my desk. I politely reminded him of the ironclad penalty clauses his company had signed. I informed him that if his crew abandoned the site, I would not only trigger the daily financial penalties that would bankrupt his firm within a month, but I would also replace his crew within 48 hours with a specialized cold-weather construction team I had already vetted from Canada. I had anticipated local resistance, and my contingency plans had contingency plans. As for the glass, I did not wait for the European port to resolve its labor disputes. I immediately activated my network, contacting a domestic aerospace manufacturer I had worked with on a previous boutique hotel project in the Pacific Northwest. I negotiated a rapid production contract for military-grade thermally insulated smart glass. It cost a premium, but I offset the expense by restructuring my procurement logistics, eliminating a middleman distributor, and leveraging a tax incentive I had secured from the state for utilizing domestic manufacturing. The foreman stared at me, the arrogant smirk completely erased from his face. He realized I held every single card. His crew was back to work by 6 o'clock the next morning, pouring the specialized anti-freeze concrete mix under massive heated tents we erected over the foundation sites. For the next 10 months, I practically lived in that mobile command center. I managed multi-million-dollar crisis events daily, fueled by black coffee and sheer, unadulterated willpower. I navigated aggressive environmental preservation audits, coordinated the helicopter transport of heavy geothermal drilling equipment when the access roads iced over, and oversaw the meticulous interior design of each cabin. I sourced reclaimed local timber for the custom furniture and imported sustainable hand-woven textiles for the linens. I demanded perfection in every detail, from the ambient smart lighting systems to the heated stone floors in the spa-inspired bathrooms. It was exhausting, grueling work. My days started before the sun rose and ended long after it set. Yet I had never felt more powerful. Every problem I solved, every contract I negotiated, every obstacle I crushed under the weight of my business acumen felt like a definitive victory over my past. I was proving to myself that my father's assessment of my worth was entirely wrong. He had demanded I stay in the background because business was a man's world. I was currently dominating an entire fleet of contractors, architects, and suppliers in one of the harshest environments in the country, building a hospitality empire that would soon eclipse his entire lifetime of work. As the snow began to melt and the frozen lake cracked and thawed into deep, sparkling blue water, the structures finally took their finished shape. The floating glass cabins gleamed in the spring sunlight, masterpieces of modern engineering nestled perfectly into the rugged forest. I stood on the massive cedar deck of the main lodge, watching my vision transition from a digital blueprint into absolute reality. The ruins I had inherited were gone. The sanctuary was built. Now it was time to open the doors and quietly amass the fortune that would eventually trigger my family's ultimate downfall. I did not cut a ribbon or invite the local press when the Aurora Haven officially opened its doors. There were no grand announcements or flashy marketing campaigns. In the world of extreme luxury, exclusivity is determined by who you keep out just as much as who you let in. I wanted my resort to function as a closely guarded secret, a whisper among the absolute elite. My strategy was to create an environment of total isolation and uncompromising service, making the property an irresistible magnet for people whose daily lives were suffocated by public attention. My first clients were the executive board of the multinational tech firm I had discreetly approached months earlier. They chartered private jets into the nearest regional airport, where my black car service intercepted them and drove them the rest of the way up the mountain. When they stepped out onto the heated stone driveway and saw the glass cabins hovering over the pristine lake, the reaction was exactly what I had engineered. They were stunned into total silence. I delivered an absolutely flawless experience. Every guest was assigned a dedicated concierge who anticipated their needs before a single word was spoken. The private chefs prepared hyper-local tasting menus using ingredients sourced from surrounding artisan farms and served them in the main dining lodge beside a roaring fire. In the evenings, the guests retreated to their cantilevered cabins. The smart glass transitioned from opaque to crystal clear, allowing them to lie in their heated beds and watch the spectacular green and purple ribbons of the Aurora Borealis dance across the pitch-black Minnesota sky. It was a digital detox wrapped in unparalleled opulence. By the time that corporate retreat ended, the executives were practically begging me to secure reservations for their personal vacations. I politely informed them that we were operating on an invitation-only basis. That strategic scarcity created a frenzy. Within weeks, My secure booking portal was flooded with inquiries from Silicon Valley founders, hedge fund managers, and high-profile figures seeking refuge from the relentless pace of their lives. The financial returns were staggering and immediate. We charged $2,500 a night per cabin, with a strict 3-night minimum stay. With 12 cabins running at 98% occupancy, my gross revenue projections were shattered in the first quarter. Cash poured into the corporate accounts of Northern Lights Holdings. I systematically crushed the operational overhead, aggressively paid down the principal on my commercial development loan, and watched my profit margins expand into the stratosphere. I was generating more liquid capital in a single month than my father had accumulated in 5 years of running his traditional portfolios. Yet while my wealth grew exponentially, my personal life remained completely austere and deliberately invisible. I did not buy a penthouse in the city or a fleet of exotic sports cars. I maintained my modest rented apartment in Duluth. I drove an unassuming all-wheel drive SUV that blended seamlessly into the harsh winter environment. If anyone saw me at the local grocery store or grabbing a coffee downtown, they saw a quietly focused woman in a wool coat, not the architect of a multi-million-dollar hospitality empire. My digital footprint was virtually non-existent. I employed a specialized reputation management firm to actively scrub any mention of my name from public databases and hospitality industry publications. When high-profile guests posted obscure photos of the resort on their private social media accounts, my legal team enforced the strict geotagging restrictions written into their confidentiality agreements. The Aurora Haven existed as a phantom location, a legendary retreat that could not be easily found on a map or traced back to a single human owner. This absolute secrecy was not just a branding strategy. It was my primary defense mechanism against the toxicity of my bloodline. I knew that my mother and brother were still living in their delusion back in California. They were accustomed to broadcasting every minor achievement, inflating their status through designer labels and country club memberships. They could not fathom the concept of silent wealth. To them, if you were not flaunting your money, it meant you did not have any. I found profound psychological satisfaction in this contrast. I would sit in my office at the resort, monitoring the 7-figure balances in my holding accounts, while fully aware that my family still pictured me shivering in a rotting shack. I was playing a completely different game on a board they did not even know existed. Every dollar I earned was another brick in the fortress that kept me safe from their entitlement and their endless demands. I operated my empire with ruthless efficiency, delegating daily operations to my highly compensated management team while I focused entirely on strategic growth and wealth accumulation. I reinvested the profits into the property, constantly elevating the guest experience to justify subsequent rate increases. I was entirely self-sufficient, financially secure, and completely liberated from the suffocating expectations that had defined my childhood. I had achieved the ultimate form of independence. I had built a fortune that my father had explicitly tried to prevent me from having, and I had done it by weaponizing the very land he thought would be my punishment. The irony was a quiet daily victory that fueled my ambition. But the isolation I had so carefully constructed could only last as long as my family remained blinded by their own arrogance. I knew it was only a matter of time before their reckless financial behavior collided with my silent success, setting the stage for a confrontation that would rip the family hierarchy to shreds. The contrast between my reality and their delusion became a psychological study in arrogance. As the first year of operations closed, Northern Lights Holdings posted an 8-figure net profit. I was reviewing those exact financials sitting in my minimalist executive suite at the resort when my phone lit up with a text from Harrison. It was a photo of him standing on the hood of a brand new Porsche 911 parked in the circular driveway of the Los Angeles estate. The caption read, "Just picked up my new daily driver. How is the rust bucket holding up in the tundra? Hope you learned how to chop your own firewood." I stared at the image, tracing the lines of the aggressively financed sports car. He was hemorrhaging money. The LA property taxes alone were massive, and instead of generating revenue, he was liquidating our father's hard-earned cash to fund an aesthetic. I did not respond. I simply locked my phone and returned to my balance sheets. My silence was not born of intimidation. It was tactical. Every unanswered text reinforced his belief that I was too embarrassed by my failure to engage. My mother was far more insidious. Cynthia preferred the guise of maternal concern, a weapon she wielded with expert precision. She would call every few months, timing it perfectly for when she assumed I was at my most vulnerable. Lauren, sweetheart. She would sigh into the receiver. I was just talking to your brother about your little cabin project. We are both so worried about you out there in the freezing cold all alone. It is not too late to admit you made a mistake. Harrison knows a contractor who might buy the land for scrap value. She never asked if I was happy. She never asked what I was actually building. She was completely trapped in her own narrative where I was the pathetic outcast desperately needing salvation. I would listen to her feigned pity while watching a helicopter transport a Silicon Valley billionaire and his security detail onto my private helipad. "I am doing fine, Mom," I would reply, my tone perfectly flat, just keeping my head down. "That is what worries me, Lauren," she would counter, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. "You always were so stubborn. Your brother just threw an incredible networking gala at the estate. He had city councilmen and producers there. He is really honoring your father's legacy. If you would just come back and apologize, I am sure he could find a clerical position for you in one of his new startups." The restraint required to not laugh out loud was monumental. Harrison was hosting pool parties masquerading as networking events, while I was hosting closed-door corporate retreats for the people who actually ran those producers and politicians. I was the sanctuary for the architects of the modern economy, while Harrison was merely entertaining the court jesters. I let them talk. I let them build their cathedral of arrogance. They needed me to be a failure to validate their own choices. If I succeeded, it meant my father was wrong. If my father was wrong, the entire foundation of their toxic family hierarchy crumbled. They sent me pictures of catered dinners and designer watches, while I quietly acquired the commercial plots adjacent to the state park, securing a total monopoly on the local ecotourism market. Their gaslighting was the ultimate camouflage. It allowed me to operate in total darkness. I never had to worry about my mother showing up unannounced or my brother demanding a cut of my profits because they genuinely believed there were no profits to be had. They assumed my silence was shame. They had no idea it was the discipline of a predator waiting for the prey to exhaust itself. As the second year rolled into the third, the tone of their messages began to subtly shift. The lavish photos from Harrison became less frequent. The boastful updates about his crypto investments vanished entirely. Cynthia's calls became shorter, marked by a strained underlying anxiety she tried to hide behind her usual condescension. She stopped asking about my little cabin project and started making vague complaints about the economy and how hard it was to find reliable investment advice. The financial bleed was starting to show. Harrison was beginning to realize that liquid cash is finite and a $4 million estate is a massive liability when you have zero reliable income. But pride is a venomous thing, and neither of them could admit the ship was sinking. They clung to the narrative of the golden child maintaining the facade even as the banks began to circle. I watched it all unfold from my sanctuary in Minnesota. I read the subtle cues in their texts, the unsaid panic in my mother's voice. They were running out of time and they were running out of money. I knew that when the crash finally happened, their arrogance would instantly mutate into entitlement. They would look for a lifeline, and they would look straight at me. They thought I was a safety net. They could simply reel in whenever they pleased. They were completely unprepared for the fortress I had built, and the absolute devastation I was about to unleash when they finally arrived at my gates. The implosion of an unearned empire does not happen quietly. It is a spectacular, loud, and messy collapse. The news reached me on a crisp Tuesday morning, exactly 3 years and 2 months after the reading of my father's will. I was sitting in my executive office at the Aurora Haven, reviewing our quarterly expansion projections when my private line rang. The caller identification showed a Los Angeles area code. It was an old industry contact, a senior acquisitions director for a major commercial real estate firm. We had collaborated on a complex boutique hotel zoning issue years ago before I moved to Minnesota. He knew my maiden name and he knew my family background. He did not call to exchange pleasantries. In the world of high stakes, real estate information is currency, and he was offering me a piece of incredibly valuable intelligence. He asked if I was still closely tied to my brother Harrison. When I informed him that we were estranged, he let out a low whistle and told me I was lucky to be entirely disconnected from the blast radius. He told me the Bel Air estate my father had left to Harrison was entering pre-foreclosure. The whispers in the luxury real estate market were spreading like wildfire, and the details were staggering. I asked for the full scope of the situation, and he painted a picture of absolute financial carnage. Harrison had not just spent the liquid assets our father left him. He had treated the $4.2 million luxury estate like an infinite automated teller machine, assuming the property value would continuously rise, and his own non-existent business acumen would eventually generate cash. He had taken out a massive primary mortgage against the paid-off property. When he burned through that initial injection of capital funding, his lavish lifestyle, he took out a secondary mortgage. Then, in an act of pure financial desperation, he secured a high-interest mezzanine loan from a predatory private equity group, using the remaining equity in the house as collateral. I asked the broker where the millions of dollars in cash had gone. He laughed a sharp, cynical sound. Harrison had dumped the vast majority of the capital into unregulated cryptocurrency platforms and obscure digital tokens right before the market experienced a historic crash. My brother had fancied himself a visionary tech investor, throwing our father's hard-earned money at digital vaporware. He was not a visionary. He was a mark. He was a wealthy, arrogant tourist who walked into a casino and got systematically fleeced by sharks who recognized his desperate need to look successful. The rest of the money had vanished into maintaining a completely fabricated image. Harrison had leased exotic sports cars, hosted lavish parties for people who only cared about his open bar, and funded a lifestyle designed exclusively for social media validation. He had built a house of cards on a foundation of unearned wealth, and a strong breeze had finally knocked it down. I thanked my contact for the information, hung up the phone, and turned to my dual monitors. I do not rely on rumors. I deal in hard, verifiable data. I logged into the Los Angeles County Public Records database and pulled the filings on my father's former estate. The screen populated with a cascade of financial disasters. Default notices from 2 different banks, massive tax liens from the county for unpaid property taxes, and at the very top of the list, a formal notice of trustee sale. The banks were officially repossessing the house. Harrison was utterly and completely bankrupt. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and looked out the floor-to-ceiling window of my office. Outside, the frozen Minnesota lake sparkled under the brilliant winter sun. My security team was conducting their perimeter patrols, and my staff was preparing the dining room for our incoming VIP guests. The Aurora Haven was generating more revenue in a single week than Harrison had managed to hold on to in 3 years. There was no joy in reading those foreclosure notices, but there was a profound, chilling satisfaction. My father had justified his blatantly sexist decision by claiming Harrison was the smart investment. He had deemed my brother the rightful heir to the family legacy purely because of his gender and his loud, empty confidence. He had looked at me, a woman who had spent years mastering commercial development, and handed me a rotting shack, assuming I would fail. The public records on my screen were the ultimate, indisputable proof that my father's judgment was fatally flawed. He had handed his golden boy a fully funded fortress, and Harrison had burned it to the ground from the inside. I knew exactly what was happening back in California. Harrison was not facing this crisis alone. He had Cynthia. My mother would be in absolute hysterics, scrambling to protect her favorite child from the severe consequences of his own arrogance. I could easily picture the frantic dynamic playing out in that doomed Los Angeles house. Cynthia would be draining her own widow safety net accounts to pay his overdue property taxes, trying to buy him just one more month of time. She would be hiring expensive defense lawyers to delay the foreclosure proceedings, refusing to accept that the war was already lost. But the deficit was simply too massive. Harrison was drowning in millions of dollars of high-interest debt, and my mother's remaining savings could not cover a fraction of it. The banks were closing in, their credit was completely destroyed, and their social standing in their affluent community was evaporating by the second. They were entirely out of options. They needed a massive injection of capital immediately to stop the bleeding. And in their deeply entitled minds, there was only one place left to look. They would look north. They still genuinely believed I was living in a dilapidated fishing camp on a patch of worthless dirt. But more importantly, they believed that because I was the compliant daughter, that dirt still fundamentally belonged to the family. They were going to try to take it from me. They were going to try to sell my land to bail out the golden child. I locked my computer screen and took a slow sip of my coffee. The trap I had spent 3 years building was fully operational, and the predators were finally heading straight for the gates. The onslaught started on a Thursday. My phone screen lit up with my mother's name blinking insistently against the polished oak of my desk. I did not pick up. I knew better than to engage with Cynthia when she was operating on a deficit of panic. I simply let the call roll to voicemail. Then came another, and another. By noon, I had 7 voicemails sitting in my inbox. I put on my noise-canceling headphones, pressed play on the first message, and continued reviewing the quarterly wine budget for my Michelin-starred dining room. "Lauren, it is your mother. Pick up the phone." Her tone was not panicked. It was brisk, commanding, and laced with that familiar sickening entitlement. "Your brother has encountered a minor speed bump with his investments. The market has been terribly unfair to him lately. We are restructuring the family assets to help him bridge the gap." A minor speed bump. That was what she called defaulting on 3 mortgages and squandering millions of dollars of unearned wealth. I clicked to the next message. Her voice grew sharper. "Lauren, I need you to listen to me carefully. I know you have grown attached to your little camping project out there in the woods, but it is time to be realistic. The family needs liquidity. I spoke with a commercial developer here in California. He has a contact in the Midwest who is willing to take that Minnesota plot off your hands for scrap value. It is not much, but combined with my savings, it will be enough to stop the bank from harassing Harrison." I paused the audio and looked out my window. A private helicopter was currently descending onto my heated helipad, delivering a tech billionaire who had paid $50,000 to rent 3 cabins for the weekend. My mother was trying to sell my multi-million-dollar empire for scrap value to pay off Harrison's leased sports cars. I pressed play on the third message. The mask was starting to slip. "Lauren, this is not a request. You are completely off the grid, doing absolutely nothing with your life, while your brother is trying to salvage your father's legacy. Pack your things, call the county clerk, and get the deed transfer paperwork started today. Harrison is going to take over the negotiations with the developer. You just need to sign the bottom line." She genuinely believed I was sitting in a freezing shack wearing layers of flannel waiting for her instructions. She thought my inheritance was a shared family piggy bank ready to be smashed open the second her golden child ran out of cash. In her mind, Richard's will was just a temporary arrangement. The moment Harrison needed a safety net, I was expected to lie down and become it. The voicemails continued, each one escalating in aggressive desperation. She blamed the cryptocurrency crash. She blamed predatory lenders. She blamed the economy. She blamed everyone and everything except the 36-year-old man who had deliberately flushed an absolute fortune down the drain. According to Cynthia, Harrison was a victim of circumstance, and I was being a selfish, ungrateful daughter by not answering the phone immediately to surrender my property. "Your father would be disgusted by your silence," she hissed in the final message. "He gave you that land so you would have something of your own, and this is how you repay the family. By ignoring us in our hour of need. Have the deed ready, Lauren. We are done playing games." I took off my headphones and let out a slow, steady breath. The absolute delusion was staggering. She was trying to orchestrate the sale of an asset she did not own to an unnamed developer on behalf of a son who was currently facing total financial annihilation. She had completely bypassed logic, operating solely on the toxic belief that my existence was meant to serve Harrison's comfort. She actually thought she could snap her fingers across the country and strip me of my livelihood. I did not return her calls. I did not send a text explaining that the land was no longer in my personal name, or that the property was currently generating 8 figures a year. Educating them over the phone would only give them time to strategize and regroup. I wanted them to walk blindly into the reality they had created. I wanted them to feel the full crushing weight of their own ignorance. Instead, I downloaded the audio files of her voicemails and forwarded them directly to my asset protection attorney with a single sentence: "Keep these on file for the extortion claims." Then I called David, my head of security. He answered immediately. "David, we are upgrading the threat assessment." I told him, my voice perfectly level. "My family is in severe financial distress and they are demanding the deed to the property. They believe this is an abandoned fishing camp. I anticipate they will escalate from phone calls to a physical appearance very soon. I want all perimeter cameras on active alert. If anyone matching the profiles of my mother or brother approaches the main gate, they are not to be granted access without my explicit direct authorization." "Understood, ma'am," David replied. "We will double the gate shifts and log all unauthorized vehicles." I ended the call and leaned back in my chair. The trap was set. My mother had fired her warning shots blindly, throwing demands into the void, assuming I would fold out of lifelong habit. She expected the compliant, overlooked middle child to surrender. She had no idea she was demanding the keys from a woman who had forged an impenetrable fortress out of the very ruins they had discarded. Let them come, I thought, watching the snow begin to fall over the pristine lake. Let them drive all the way out here. They were about to learn exactly what happens when you try to steal from a ghost. Harrison's flight into Duluth landed in the middle of a brutal gray afternoon. He stepped off the plane wearing a thin designer jacket, completely unsuited for the biting wind rolling off Lake Superior. He had expected to solve this problem quickly, fly in, rent an aggressive-looking SUV drive to whatever frozen swamp I was hiding in, and bully me into signing over the deed. In his mind, I was still the quiet, compliant sister who would fold the moment he raised his voice. He genuinely believed he was doing me a favor, freeing me from a worthless piece of land while saving his own skin. He picked up a leased Jeep Wrangler from the rental counter, ignoring the clerk's warnings about black ice on the rural routes. Harrison had always believed that rules and natural consequences simply didn't apply to him. He cranked the heat, connected his phone to the sound system, and headed north, completely confident in his impending victory. The drive from Duluth up the North Shore is stunning, but it is also isolating. As the city faded into the rearview mirror, the landscape transformed into a dense, towering wall of evergreens and jagged rock formations. The cellular service dropped to a single bar, then nothing. Harrison was alone, navigating winding, snow-packed roads that cut through the silence of the wilderness. He gripped the steering wheel, his irritation mounting. He couldn't fathom why anyone would choose to live in this desolate, freezing landscape. He muttered to himself, cursing the cold and complaining about the lack of signal. He rehearsed the speech he was going to give me, a condescending lecture about family loyalty and financial reality. He would explain that my little experiment was over and that the adults needed the land to salvage their father's legacy. He had already promised our mother he would have the signed transfer papers in his hands before dinner. As the miles ticked by, the GPS coordinates pointed him toward a deeply forested peninsula. The road narrowed, the snowbanks on either side growing higher. He expected the pavement to turn to gravel, leading to a rutted, neglected driveway. He expected a mailbox falling off a rotted post. He was preparing to confront a sister who had failed a sister, shivering in a cabin, desperate for an excuse to leave. Instead, the GPS announced his arrival at the destination. Harrison slowed the Jeep, squinting through the falling snow. The road didn't end in mud. It widened perfectly into a smooth, heated driveway, completely clear of ice. He rolled to a stop, his confusion deepening. He checked the coordinates again, assuming the GPS had glitched, but the location matched perfectly. He looked ahead, expecting to see the collapsing roof of the 1940s fishing camp he had mocked for 3 years. He didn't see ruins, he saw the gates. They were massive, imposing structures forged from matte black steel and solid local stone, standing in stark, defiant contrast to the surrounding wilderness. They weren't welcoming. They were a declaration of absolute boundaries. The gates were closed, seamlessly integrated into a high-security fence that disappeared into the tree line on either side. Harrison put the Jeep in park, the engine idling in the quiet cold. He stared at the brass intercom panel gleaming under the soft ambient lighting. This wasn't right. There had to be a mistake. He grabbed his phone, desperate to call our mother to ask if she had sent him to the wrong county. But the screen still showed no service. He was cut off, standing at the threshold of a reality he was entirely unprepared for. He stepped out of the warm vehicle, immediately hit by the bitter cold. He approached the intercom, his arrogant swagger replaced by a hesitant, jerky walk. He pressed the call button, expecting a confused homeowner or perhaps an angry caretaker. He planned to demand directions to the old fishing camp, ready to leverage his family name. Instead, a voice answered immediately, clear, professional, and completely unfazed. "Welcome to the Aurora Haven. Please state your name and the nature of your business." Harrison froze. The name meant nothing to him, but the tone of the voice sent a distinct chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the Minnesota winter. It was the voice of a gatekeeper, someone accustomed to turning away people exactly like him. He gripped the collar of his thin jacket, his breath pluming in the freezing air. He was standing on my land, looking at my gates, completely unaware that the trap he had walked into was about to snap shut. He cleared his throat, trying to summon the arrogant confidence that had failed him in Los Angeles. "I'm Harrison," he demanded, his voice cracking slightly in the cold. "I'm looking for my sister. Let me in." "Let him through." I instructed my head of security over the secure communications channel. "Do not offer him valet service. Direct his vehicle to the temporary loading zone beside the main lodge. I want him to walk past the dining room windows." The heavy matte black gates glided silently apart, slipping into the stone pillars. I sat at the command desk in my executive office, watching the high-definition security monitors. Harrison hesitated for a fraction of a second before taking his foot off the brake. His rented Jeep crept forward, crossing the threshold onto the pristine, heated driveway. I tracked his progress camera by camera, watching the exact moment the delusion he and my mother had constructed over the past 3 years violently shattered. The winding private road was deliberately designed to build anticipation. For the first half-mile, thick snow-draped evergreen trees obscured the view, keeping the property hidden in the wilderness. Harrison drove slowly, leaning over his steering wheel. I could see the profound confusion settling into his posture. He had flown halfway across the country, expecting to navigate a treacherous dirt path to a rotting 1940s fishing camp. He expected to find me shivering by a wood stove, desperate for human contact and eager to sign away my inheritance just to escape the cold. Then the tree line broke and the full magnitude of the Aurora Haven revealed itself. Harrison slammed on the brakes. The Jeep jerked to a halt right in the middle of the heated driveway. He stared out the windshield, completely paralyzed. Before him sat a breathtaking architectural marvel that commanded the frozen landscape. The main lodge was a masterpiece of modern design, utilizing massive reclaimed timber soaring walls of triple-pane glass and sleek dark metal accents. To his left, the discreet valet station was occupied by a fleet of high-end vehicles. Matte black Range Rovers, armored luxury SUVs, and imported sports cars belonging to tech executives and venture capitalists who paid a premium for absolute isolation. He slowly stepped out of his vehicle, completely forgetting the bitter Minnesota wind cutting through his thin designer jacket. The security cameras captured his face in crystal-clear definition. His jaw hung slightly slack. His eyes darted frantically across the property, trying to process the visual data that directly contradicted everything he believed to be true. He looked down toward the frozen lake and saw the 12 cantilevered glass cabins hovering elegantly above the pristine white shoreline. He saw the subtle glow of the ambient smart lighting system illuminating the walkways. He saw the impeccably dressed staff moving quietly and efficiently across the grounds, carrying premium ski equipment and guiding guests toward the private ice pavilions. The faint scent of wood smoke and expensive locally sourced cuisine drifting from the Michelin-starred dining room hit the freezing air. He thought he had taken a wrong turn into a billionaire's private compound. But then his gaze tracked back to the main lodge and landed on the minimalist brass logo etched into the stone entryway. The Aurora Haven. He knew the property lines. He knew the geography from the old family deed. The reality finally connected in his brain. This was the swamp shack. This was the worthless plot of dirt our father had tossed to the middle child as a joke. The color drained entirely from Harrison's face. For one fleeting, deeply satisfying second, I saw genuine, visceral humiliation wash over him. He realized how spectacularly he had underestimated me. He realized that while he was busy destroying our father's $4 million Los Angeles estate, I had been out in the wilderness quietly building an empire worth tens of millions. The sister he had mocked, the sister he had planned to bully into submission, had outplayed him on a scale he could barely comprehend. But a golden child does not hold on to humiliation for long. In a toxic mind, shame quickly mutates into self-preservation. I watched the live feed as the shock in his eyes rapidly dissolved, giving way to something much darker. His expression tightened, his breathing changed. The panic of his looming bankruptcy, the 3 defaulted mortgages, and the angry private equity lenders suddenly collided with the absolute fortune standing right in front of him. His face shifted into a mask of pure, sickening greed. He did not look at the resort and see my relentless hard work. He did not see the brutal winters I endured, the aggressive commercial loans I secured, or the flawless business strategy I executed. He saw a lifeline. He saw a gold mine sitting on dirt that used to belong to our father. In his deeply entitled brain, that meant the gold mine automatically belonged to him. Harrison slammed his car door shut and marched toward the main lodge. His steps were quick and aggressive, fueled by a sudden, desperate adrenaline. He marched past the valet stand, ignoring the attendant, who tried to direct him to the loading zone. He pulled open the heavy glass doors of the lobby and stepped inside, bringing a gust of freezing air with him. I left my office and walked out onto the second-floor interior balcony that overlooked the grand lobby. The space below was a sanctuary of quiet luxury. A massive stone fireplace roared in the center, warming the high-net-worth guests conversing in low tones on custom leather seating. Harrison stood dripping melted snow onto the polished slate floors, looking wildly out of place in his cheap rented winter gear. He spun around, taking in the soaring ceilings, the custom artwork, and the sheer undeniable wealth of the operation. Then his eyes locked onto me, standing perfectly still by the glass railing. I was wearing a tailored designer suit, projecting the exact kind of untouchable authority he had tried and failed to buy in Los Angeles. I did not smile. I did not greet him. I simply looked down at the brother who had come to steal my ruins, only to find an impenetrable fortress. Lauren. His voice echoed too loudly in the serene space, drawing irritated glances from a nearby table of investors. What the hell is this? I walked slowly down the grand staircase, the rhythmic click of my heels cutting through the tension. I stopped on the final step, keeping the height advantage and maintaining a cold professional distance. "This is my property, Harrison," I replied, my voice low and dangerously calm. "And you are tracking snow into my lobby." He took a step forward, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. The arrogance returned, but it was brittle shaking under the weight of his own desperation. "Do not play games with me, Lauren," he sneered. "You took Dad's land and built a hotel. You used the family inheritance to fund a commercial project. That means this is family property. Dad's will gave me the business assets. This belongs to the family." The absolute delusion required to speak those words was staggering. He was totally bankrupt, standing in a lobby that generated more revenue in a month than he had seen in his entire life, demanding that I hand it over to cover his failures. He thought the rules of our childhood still applied. He thought he could just point at my success and claim it. He had no idea that I had spent the last 3 years building a legal and financial guillotine, and he had just willingly placed his head right on the block. I looked at him standing there with snow melting off his cheap boots onto my imported slate floor. The silence in the lobby had grown absolute. Every high net worth guest in the vicinity had stopped their quiet conversations to watch a grown man unravel. Harrison breathed heavily, his chest heaving as if he had just run a marathon. He was waiting for me to back down to revert to the timid middle child who used to surrender her allowance just to keep the peace at the dinner table. "You are entirely mistaken," I said, my voice projecting a calm, absolute authority that left no room for debate. "Richard gave you the business assets and the liquid cash. He gave me a parcel of undeveloped land. I took my land and I built an empire. You took your inheritance and you burned it to ash. There is no family equity here, Harrison. There is only my corporate equity, and you do not possess a single share." Harrison stepped forward, his face twisting into an ugly mask of desperation and rage. "You think a piece of paper stops me?" he demanded, pointing a shaking finger at my chest. Mom already spoke to the attorneys in Los Angeles. Dad was not of sound mind when he divided the properties. He never intended for you to own a commercial enterprise. He intended for this land to be a shared family trust. You exploited a sick old man to steal the family legacy. We are taking it back. The sheer audacity of his argument was almost physically repulsive. He was actively trying to rewrite history to save his own skin. "If Dad was not of sound mind when he signed the will," I replied, my tone turning razor sharp, "then that invalidates your ownership of the $4 million Los Angeles estate you just lost to the bank. You cannot selectively void a legal document just because you are suddenly jealous of the sister you spent 3 years mocking." My words struck a nerve. He flinched, but the panic of his impending bankruptcy drove him forward. He closed the distance between us, invading my personal space in a blatant attempt at physical intimidation. "I need 50% of this operating company today, Lauren," he hissed, his voice dropping to a frantic whisper. "Do you understand me? The private equity lenders are threatening to seize everything. I am losing the cars. I am losing the house. You are going to call your lawyers right now and draft a transfer of ownership. We will sell this entire resort to the commercial developer Mom found. It is the only way to clear my debts." He was completely unhinged. He was ordering me to liquidate a highly profitable ultra-luxury eco-resort so he could pay off the predatory loans he took out to fund a fabricated lifestyle. "You are not listening to me, Harrison," I said, refusing to step back. "I do not own this land. Northern Lights Holdings owns this land. The land is held in an irrevocable trust. You cannot sue me for it because my name is not on the deed. You cannot force a sale because you have zero jurisdiction over the corporate entity. You are demanding keys to a kingdom that is legally bulletproof. You have nothing." The reality of my legal armor finally began to penetrate his thick skull. His eyes darted around the magnificent lobby, taking in the custom stonework, the soaring glass, and the impeccable staff. He realized he could not simply bully his way into my bank accounts. The shock mutated into a violent, explosive tantrum. "You stole from me!" he screamed, his voice cracking as it echoed off the high ceilings. "You stole my future. This was supposed to be my safety net. You greedy, selfish little manipulator. You sat out here in the woods and plotted against your own blood. Mom was right about you. You have always been a jealous, bitter snake." His face was bright red and spittle flew from his lips. Several guests discreetly signaled my staff, clearly disturbed by the aggressive outburst. I did not need to raise a hand. I simply caught the eye of David, my head of security, who was already moving swiftly across the lobby, with 2 broad-shouldered security personnel right behind him. "We are going to freeze every single dime you have." Harrison continued to rant, completely unaware of the security team closing in behind him. "We are filing an injunction tomorrow morning. I am going to drag you through probate court for the next 10 years, until you are completely bankrupt. I will bleed you dry in legal fees, Lauren. I will take this entire building apart brick by brick until you are begging me for a job." David stepped smoothly between us, placing a large, firm hand directly on Harrison's chest, stopping his forward momentum. "Sir, it is time for you to leave," David said, his voice vibrating with professional menace. Harrison slapped David's hand away, a massive mistake. "Do not touch me, you glorified bouncer," he yelled. "I am her brother. I own half of this property." David did not flinch. He simply nodded to the 2 security guards. In one synchronized fluid motion, they flanked Harrison, grabbing him by the arms and twisting his wrists into a compliance hold that immediately locked his elbows. Harrison gasped in pain, his knees buckling slightly as they forced him to turn around. "Get your hands off me!" he shrieked, struggling violently against their grip. "Lauren, tell them to let me go. You cannot do this to your own family." I stood perfectly still, watching the pathetic display of a man who had finally hit a boundary he could not cross. "I told you before, Harrison family does not steal. You came here to strip me of my livelihood because you were too arrogant to manage your own. You have exactly 10 seconds to get off my property before I have David call the local sheriff and press formal charges for criminal trespassing and verbal assault." The security guards marched him briskly toward the heavy glass doors. Harrison kicked and thrashed his expensive designer boots slipping on the polished stone. He looked like a petulant child being dragged out of a toy store. The wealthy guests watched in absolute silence as the supposed heir to the family legacy was physically humiliated and thrown out into the freezing Minnesota winter. They pushed him through the front doors and shoved him toward his rented Jeep. I watched through the soaring windows as the freezing wind immediately hit him. He stumbled against the side of his vehicle, pointing a shaking finger back at the lodge. He was screaming something, but the thick thermal glass blocked the sound completely, reducing his rage to a silent, pathetic pantomime. I turned my back on him and walked toward my executive office. My pulse was elevated, but my mind was crystal clear. The physical confrontation was over, but the true war had just been declared. Harrison and Cynthia were desperate cornered animals facing total financial ruin. They were going to hire the most vicious predatory lawyers they could find on credit and attempt to tear my life apart. They were going to launch a campaign of legal sabotage and emotional manipulation designed to break my resolve. As I sat down at my desk and pulled up my secure email server, I felt a cold, sharp smile touch my lips. They thought a cease and desist letter would terrify me. They thought they could use the legal system to bully me into submission. They had absolutely no idea that I was already 10 steps ahead, holding the exact ammunition needed to completely obliterate whatever remained of their shattered lives. The battle lines were drawn and I was fully prepared to watch them destroy themselves. The attack came exactly 4 days after my security team dragged Harrison out of my lobby. I knew my brother and mother were desperate, but I had briefly underestimated just how low they were willing to sink to save themselves from financial ruin. They could not accept that I had legally outmaneuvered them, so they decided to rewrite history entirely. The threat arrived on a Thursday morning via a priority legal courier. I was sitting at my desk finalizing a seasonal menu with my executive chef when my assistant brought in a thick, heavily sealed envelope. The return address belonged to Bradley Thorne, a Los Angeles attorney notorious in real estate circles. He was what industry insiders called a legal predator. He did not take cases to win justice. He took cases to bleed wealthy estates dry, forcing massive settlements simply to make the relentless litigation stop. Harrison and Cynthia had hired a shark on credit, betting everything on the assumption that I would pay them off to protect my peace. I dismissed my chef, locked my office door, and sliced the envelope open. Inside was a formal cease and desist order, alongside a notice of intent to sue. As I read through the 30 pages of legal fiction, a cold, sharp anger settled in my chest. Bradley Thorne was demanding an immediate freeze of all financial accounts associated with Northern Lights Holdings. He demanded that I surrender 50% of the corporate equity to Harrison immediately and relinquish all managerial control of the Aurora Haven until a judge could review the estate. But the demands were not the most sickening part. It was the foundation of their argument that truly showed the depths of their depravity. According to the official filing, my mother and brother were claiming that my father, Richard, was not of sound mind when he executed his final will. They were officially alleging that he had been suffering from undiagnosed cognitive decline, and that I had somehow manipulated a sick elderly man into signing over the Minnesota property. They claimed that Richard had always intended for the lakeside land to remain a shared family trust, a protective asset meant to financially support the entire bloodline in perpetuity. The sheer, unadulterated hypocrisy of their claim was breathtaking. My father had been a ruthless, sharp-minded businessman right up until the day his heart gave out. He was not senile. He was a proud, unapologetic misogynist who deliberately handed his golden son a $4 million Los Angeles estate and handed his daughter a rotting, worthless pile of wood because he did not believe a woman belonged in commercial development. He had designed his will to be an insult. Furthermore, if they genuinely believed my father lacked the mental capacity to divide his assets, that exact same logic would legally invalidate Harrison's ownership of the Los Angeles estate he had just lost to the bank. It was a completely paradoxical argument. But Bradley Thorne did not care about logic. He cared about leverage. The lawsuit was not designed to hold up in a trial. It was a scorched earth intimidation tactic. They wanted to file injunctions in California courts, dragging me into a costly, drawn-out jurisdictional nightmare. They wanted to freeze my operational accounts, disrupt my payroll, and create so much administrative chaos that I would simply write them a $10 million check just to make them go away. I picked up my phone and called my asset protection attorney, Charles. I read the core claims aloud to him, waiting for his professional assessment. Charles let out a dark, cynical laugh. "It is pure garbage, Lauren," he said, his voice completely unfazed. "Your trust is impenetrable, and the corporate veil of Northern Lights Holdings was forged in steel. They cannot simply pierce a limited liability company because they feel entitled to the profits. However, they are banking on the nuisance factor. Bradley Thorne is going to file a tidal wave of frivolous motions in California. He wants to force you to travel, pay exorbitant defense fees, and suffer through depositions. He is trying to create a massive distraction. Can he freeze my operating accounts?" I asked, my mind immediately shifting to my staff and my daily resort operations. "He can certainly try to petition a judge for an emergency injunction," Charles explained. "We will block it, but it will require aggressive defensive litigation. We need to be prepared for a very loud, very ugly public fight. They are going to try to drag your name through the mud to apply maximum pressure." I thanked Charles, authorized him to deploy our defense strategy, and hung up the phone. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. They wanted an ugly fight. They wanted to drag me down into the mud with them. Right on cue, my private line began to ring. The caller identification showed my mother's number. I pressed the speakerphone button, letting the call connect, and listened without saying a word. "Lauren, darling!" Her voice floated out of the speaker, dripping with a sickening manufactured sweetness. "I assume you received the package from Mr. Thorne today. I want you to know it breaks my heart that things had to come to this." She paused, waiting for me to argue or defend myself. When I remained absolutely silent, she continued, her tone shifting seamlessly into the role of the benevolent peacemaker. "Bradley is a very aggressive lawyer, Lauren. He is prepared to tie up your little hotel in court for years. We do not want to destroy you. We really do not. We just want what is fair. Your father meant for that land to support the family. Harrison is family. You have more money than you could ever need now. Just sign over Harrison's half and I will call Bradley off today. We can put all this ugliness behind us. Do not make us ruin you." The gaslighting was masterful. She was actively partnering with a predatory lawyer to smear my dead father's mental state and steal my life's work. Yet she was framing herself as the generous savior, offering me a way out. She was holding a gun to the head of my business and calling it an act of maternal love. I reached out and pressed the button to end the call, cutting off her toxic performance mid-sentence. I realized in that moment that playing defense would never be enough. If I simply fought them in court, I would be tied to their sinking ship for years. Even if I won every single legal motion, they would continue to bleed my energy, my time, and my peace. A defensive victory was still a loss. I needed a kill shot. I needed ammunition so absolutely devastating that Bradley Thorne would immediately drop them as clients out of self-preservation. I needed a counterstrike that would legally and financially obliterate them before they could ever set foot in a courtroom. I needed to know exactly what kind of fraudulent mess Harrison had created back in Los Angeles before the banks foreclosed on him. I sat at my desk, calculating my next move, turning over every possible angle to expose them. I was preparing to hire an elite team of private investigators to tear through Harrison's financial history. But I never had to make that call. The ammunition I desperately needed was about to be handed directly to me. My private direct line rang again. I glanced at the screen expecting to see my mother calling back to finish her extortion pitch. But it was not Cynthia. It was not Harrison. It was a Los Angeles number I had not seen on my screen in over 3 years. I picked up the receiver and held it to my ear. The voice on the other end was quiet, exhausted, and unmistakably sharp. It was someone trapped deep inside Harrison's collapsing world, someone who had watched the lies unfold and had finally reached her breaking point. The unexpected ally I never saw coming was ready to talk. Lauren. The voice was calm, distinct, and completely devoid of the panic that usually infected anyone orbiting my brother. It was Naomi. I had always respected Naomi. She was a brilliant structural engineer who had somehow been charmed by Harrison's carefully curated facade 5 years ago. I remember sitting at their wedding watching her interact with my mother. Cynthia had tried her usual passive-aggressive tactics, offering backhanded compliments about Naomi's family background, but Naomi had effortlessly dismantled every insult with a polite, razor-sharp smile. I knew then she was entirely too smart for my brother. It was only a matter of time before she saw the decay behind the gold plating. Naomi, I replied, matching her measured tone. I imagine things are rather chaotic on your end right now. She let out a dry, humorless laugh. Chaotic implies a lack of order. What is happening here is a highly organized implosion, and I refuse to be collateral damage. Naomi did not waste time on pleasantries. She did not ask how I was doing or feign ignorance about the lawsuit. She cut straight to the bone. She told me she had spent the last 72 hours quietly packing her essentials and securing her personal accounts. She was officially leaving Harrison. He told me the house was paid off, Naomi said, her voice dropping an octave heavy with restrained fury. He looked me in the eye for 3 years and told me the estate was free and clear. I found out about the foreclosures the same day the bank sent the final notice. Cynthia knew. She knew he was drowning in debt, and instead of telling me, she told him to keep up appearances so he would not look weak. That sounded exactly like my mother. Cynthia would rather watch her son's marriage disintegrate under the weight of massive financial fraud than admit her golden child was a failure. She viewed Naomi not as a daughter-in-law, but as a prop designed to make Harrison look like a successful stableman. I am sorry, Naomi, I said, and I genuinely meant it. You deserved better than the lies they sold you. I do not want an apology, Naomi replied sharply. I want to dismantle them. I know they hired Bradley Thorne. Harrison has been pacing the living room for 2 days, bragging to Cynthia on speakerphone about how they are going to freeze your assets and force you to surrender your resort. I leaned forward, my pulse quickening. They are going to try. But they are operating on the delusion that my father was legally incompetent when he divided the estate. I know, Naomi said. I read the draft of the lawsuit. It is entirely fabricated. But Lauren, that is not why I am calling. I do not care about the lawsuit. I care about what Harrison did to me to fund this delusion, and I care about what Cynthia did to your father's estate to cover it up. My breath caught. Naomi was an incredibly detail-oriented woman. If she had found something in Harrison's private files, it was guaranteed to be devastating. What did you find? I asked, my voice dropping to a whisper. Harrison locked me out of the home office when the bank notices started arriving, Naomi explained. He assumed I would just panic and cry. He forgot that I am the one who upgraded the network security for that house. I bypassed his firewalls in 20 minutes. I downloaded his entire digital footprint, every email, every bank statement, every hidden file. I closed my eyes, a fierce, predatory satisfaction washing over me. Harrison had married a woman entirely out of his league, underestimated her intelligence, and handed her the digital keys to his own destruction. He did not just lose his inheritance. Naomi continued, her voice turning ice cold. He committed felonies to try and save it, and Cynthia helped him. I am listening, I said, pressing the record button on my secure internal server. I am not going to explain it over the phone, Naomi countered. I do not trust the network on this end. Harrison is paranoid and Cynthia is desperate, but I have everything compiled on an encrypted drive. I have the exact ammunition you need to completely vaporize Bradley Thorne's lawsuit and put your brother and your mother in a concrete cell. She held the ultimate kill shot. The very thing I was preparing to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to find through private investigators was being handed to me on a silver platter by the woman my brother had betrayed. "What do you want in exchange?" I asked. In business, leverage always comes with a price, and I was more than willing to pay it. "Protection," Naomi stated simply. "I am filing for divorce tomorrow, but Harrison is vindictive and Cynthia is venomous. When they realize I have taken the documents, they will try to destroy my reputation. They will try to drag me down with them in the bankruptcy proceedings. I need a legal shield." "Done," I said without a single second of hesitation. "I will connect you with my asset protection attorney in Los Angeles immediately. He will represent you in the divorce, and I will personally cover his entire retainer. We will build a firewall around you so thick that Harrison will not even be able to legally say your name in public." I could hear the profound relief in her exhale. For years, she had been trapped in the suffocating, gaslighting atmosphere of my family, constantly told she was overreacting, constantly made to feel like the outsider. Now she had an ally who knew exactly how dangerous Cynthia and Harrison could be. "Thank you," Naomi said softly. "I will be on a flight to Chicago tonight. I am staying with my sister until the divorce is filed. I will overnight the encrypted drive directly to your attorney's office from a secure courier once I land. Do not tell Harrison you are leaving. I advised my mind, already calculating the timeline. Let him think you are going on a spa weekend or a business trip. Do not give them a chance to panic and start deleting physical files." "I already told him I am attending an architectural seminar in Seattle," Naomi replied, her tone reflecting a brilliant cold calculation. "He barely listened. He is too busy celebrating his imaginary victory over you." "Let him celebrate," I said, a dark smile spreading across my face. "Let him pop whatever cheap champagne he has left. Have a safe flight, Naomi. We will speak tomorrow." I hung up the phone and placed it gently on my desk. The silence in my office was absolute, but the energy in the room was electric. My family had spent their entire lives underestimating the women around them. My father had underestimated my business acumen because I was his daughter. Harrison had underestimated Naomi's intelligence because she was his wife. Cynthia had underestimated both of us because we refused to play by her toxic rules. They had built their entire reality on the assumption that they were untouchable. They had hired a predatory lawyer, drafted a fictional lawsuit, and intended to extort me for millions of dollars to fund their pathetic, fabricated lives. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They were completely blind to the fact that Naomi and I had just locked the doors, poured gasoline over their entire foundation, and were currently holding the match. I stood up and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window looking out at the frozen Minnesota lake. The war was no longer defensive, it was an execution. The encrypted drive arrived at Charles's Los Angeles office exactly 24 hours later via a bonded courier. I sat at my executive desk in Minnesota, staring at my dual monitors, as Charles initiated a heavily secured screen share. Naomi joined the call from a pristine, sunlit kitchen in Chicago, where she was staying with her sister. She looked exhausted, but there was a fierce, unyielding clarity in her eyes. She had stripped away the heavy burden of being Harrison's wife and replaced it with the cold efficiency of a whistleblower. Naomi did not just dump scattered files onto a hard drive. As a structural engineer, she possessed a mind built for identifying weaknesses and mapping out stress points. She had organized the data into a masterclass of forensic accounting. The root directory contained two primary folders. The first was labeled Los Angeles Property Liens. The second was simply titled Probate Violations. "Let us start with the house," Naomi said, her voice ringing through my office speakers with absolute clinical detachment. "Open the mezzanine loan application." Charles clicked the file. A scanned document appeared on the screen, complete with bank headers and signature lines. It was the high-interest predatory loan Harrison had secured to cover his massive cryptocurrency losses. "California is a community property state," Naomi explained. "Harrison could not leverage the remaining equity in the Bel Air estate without my explicit written consent. He knew I would never agree to leverage our primary residence to cover his gambling disguised as investing. So he simply bypassed me." She directed Charles to scroll to the final page. There, perfectly rendered on the digital document, was Naomi's signature. I was at an engineering conference in Denver on the date that document was supposedly signed and notarized, Naomi stated. I pulled the metadata from his desktop. Harrison used a digital forgery service and a compromised notary stamp from a former business associate. He routed the confirmation emails into a shadow folder he created on my personal laptop so I would never see the bank notifications. He committed federal wire fraud and identity theft against his own wife just to buy himself 6 more months of pretending he was a successful investor. I stared at the forged signature, feeling a sharp, icy validation. My brother was not just a failure. He was a reckless criminal who lacked the basic intelligence to cover his own tracks. He had handed a brilliant analytical woman the digital keys to his life and assumed she would never look closely enough to see the rot. But that is just the appetizer, Naomi said, leaning forward slightly on the camera feed. Open the second folder. This is where your mother steps onto the stage. Charles opened the folder labeled Probate Violations. A series of bank transfer receipts populated the screen. They were routed from an account bearing my late father's name. I checked the timestamps on the digital transfers. My breath caught in my throat. These transfers are dated 3 weeks before the will was officially probated, I said, tracing the timeline on my monitor. The estate was legally frozen. Exactly, Naomi confirmed. When your father died, Cynthia panicked. She knew Harrison was already quietly bleeding cash. She had power of attorney over your father's medical and immediate household accounts. Instead of relinquishing control to the estate executor, she illegally authorized a series of wire transfers totaling $300,000. She drained the emergency liquid reserves and routed them into a dummy corporate entity Harrison had set up months prior. Charles let out a low, sharp whistle. That is egregious estate fraud. She embezzled from her own husband's frozen estate to artificially inflate her son's bank accounts before the courts could inventory the assets. If the probate judge had caught this, she would have faced immediate criminal charges. She disguised the transfers as outstanding medical debts and property maintenance fees, Naomi continued. Harrison used that $300,000 to satisfy a massive margin call on a failed digital token. It was gone within 48 hours. Your mother committed a felony to buy her golden boy a weekend of breathing room. The profound hypocrisy of their current lawsuit washed over me. Cynthia and Harrison had hired a predatory lawyer to sue me, claiming my father was not of sound mind when he gave me the Minnesota land. They were trying to invalidate a perfectly legal will while actively hiding the fact that Cynthia had looted the estate's cash reserves before the ink on the death certificate was even dry. They were pointing fingers at my legitimate business while standing knee-deep in a swamp of federal offenses. I looked at Naomi on the screen. The level of leverage you have just handed me is absolute, I told her. I will keep my promise. Charles will handle your divorce filings, and we will build a legal firewall around you so thick they will not be able to breathe in your direction without facing a judge. Naomi gave a curt, satisfied nod. Burn them to the ground, Lauren. They deserve every single ounce of ash. She disconnected from the call, leaving Charles and me to finalize our counter-strategy. Charles leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms. Bradley Thorne has absolutely no idea his clients are walking felonies, Charles said, a predatory smile forming on his face. Thorne operates on intimidation, but he is not going to risk his own legal license to protect an embezzler and a digital forger. The second we present this evidence, Thorne will drop them instantly to save his own skin. I can draft a response to his cease and desist attaching these documents. The lawsuit will vanish by tomorrow afternoon. No, I replied, my voice echoing with a dark, unrelenting resolve. Do not send Thorne anything yet. Charles frowned, looking at the camera. Lauren, if we sit on this, they will proceed with filing the injunctions. We have the kill shot right here. Why wait? Because simply making the lawsuit disappear is entirely too easy, I explained. If we kill it quietly from a distance, they will just retreat to Los Angeles and play the victims. They will tell their country club friends that I used expensive corporate lawyers to bully them out of their rightful family legacy. They need to face the consequences in person. They need to walk willingly into a trap of their own making. I leaned forward, typing rapidly on my keyboard. I am going to send an email directly to Bradley Thorne. I am going to tell him that his aggressive legal tactics have overwhelmed me. I am going to state that I am terrified of a lengthy public court battle and that I am prepared to negotiate the surrender of family equity to keep this matter out of the press. Charles paused, his eyes widening as he caught on to the strategy. You are inviting them to the resort. I confirmed. Harrison and Cynthia are entirely driven by their own arrogance. If they believe I am surrendering, they will not handle this through proxy lawyers. They will insist on flying to Minnesota to watch me sign the papers in person. They want the satisfaction of standing in my lobby and tearing my empire out of my hands. They want to see me defeated. Charles laughed softly, shaking his head. You want to hand them their own arrest warrants in your executive office. I want to hand them absolute destruction, I corrected. Draft the formal fraud complaints regarding the $300,000. Finalize Naomi's divorce papers citing the forged loans. Package everything into neat physical folders. When they walk through my doors tomorrow expecting me to hand over the deed to the Aurora Haven, I am going to hand them a mirror instead. I spent the rest of the afternoon meticulously preparing my environment. I briefed David, my head of security, on the impending arrival of hostile actors. I ensured the executive boardroom was pristine, the glass walls wiped completely clean, providing perfect visibility from the main lobby. My mother and brother had spent their entire lives treating me like a disposable asset. They had discarded me, underestimated me, and tried to steal my future. Now, armed with their darkest secrets, I was ready to welcome them to my world. The email I sent to Bradley Thorne worked with terrifying efficiency. I had crafted the message to sound utterly defeated. I wrote that the threat of aggressive litigation had overwhelmed me, that I was terrified of a prolonged public court battle, destroying my resort's reputation, and that I was prepared to negotiate a surrender of family equity to keep the matter entirely out of the press. I knew my mother and brother. I knew their specific brand of arrogance. They could not resist a surrender, and more importantly, they could not resist the opportunity to witness my defeat in person. They wanted to stand in my lobby and rip my empire out of my hands. 2 days later, on a Friday afternoon, their rented luxury SUV pulled up to my security gates. It was peak check-in time at the Aurora Haven. The grand lobby was a masterpiece of synchronized high-end hospitality. A massive stone fireplace roared in the center of the room, casting a warm glow over the polished slate floors. My staff moved quietly and efficiently, offering hot towels and custom-infused cocktails to arriving guests. The atmosphere was serene, expensive, and completely controlled. The people lounging in the custom leather seating were venture capitalists, tech executives, and industry titans seeking absolute privacy. Then the heavy glass front doors swung open. A gust of freezing Minnesota wind whipped inside, but it was nothing compared to the toxic, frantic energy radiating from the 3 people who just crossed my threshold. Harrison marched in first, wearing a designer winter coat that I happened to know was 3 seasons old and likely purchased on a maxed-out credit card. He tried to project the aura of a conquering king, but his eyes darted around the room, betraying his desperate underlying panic. Cynthia followed close behind, draped in excessive fur and clutching a designer handbag like a shield. She tilted her chin up in a practiced pose of aristocratic suffering, pretending she owned the very air she was breathing. Flanking them was Bradley Thorne, looking exactly like what he was, a legal mercenary in a slick suit carrying a heavy leather briefcase. Harrison did not approach the concierge desk. He strode directly into the center of the main lobby, planting his snow-covered boots on a hand-woven rug, and projected his voice so it bounced off the soaring timber ceilings. I want to see my sister, he demanded loudly. Tell Lauren her brother is here to take control of the property. We have legal business to conclude right now. Cynthia placed a trembling hand over her heart, looking around at my wealthy guests with a manufactured expression of maternal grief. Please excuse the disruption, she announced to a billionaire software developer who was staring at her in bewilderment. This is family business. My daughter has gotten herself into a terrible legal mess, and we are here to rescue the estate from going under. We just want what is fair. I stepped out from the hallway leading to the administrative wing. I did not run. I did not look panicked. I wore a sharp, impeccably tailored suit, and my posture was absolute steel. David, my head of security, fell into step exactly 2 paces behind my right shoulder. Bradley Thorne immediately stepped forward, seizing the opportunity to apply maximum social pressure. He opened his briefcase right there in the middle of the lobby, wanting an audience to witness my humiliation. Lauren, he began, deliberately using my first name to diminish my authority. I am Bradley Thorne. We are here to execute the amicable surrender of 50% equity in Northern Lights Holdings and finalize the settlement regarding your late father's estate. If you refuse to sign these transfer documents today, I am prepared to file an emergency injunction in California that will freeze every single operational account tied to this resort. They expected me to panic. They expected me to shush them, to beg them to keep their voices down, and to frantically usher them away from my clients to save face. They were banking on my fear of public scandal. But they completely failed to understand the environment they had just walked into. The people sitting in my lobby were not easily scandalized suburbanites. They were apex predators of the business world. They did not look at me with pity. They looked at Harrison and Cynthia with the mild, irritated disdain reserved for unruly children throwing a tantrum in a fine dining restaurant. I stopped a few feet away from them, looking directly into Bradley Thorne's eyes with absolute freezing indifference. You traveled a long way to deliver a threat. You could have emailed Mr. Thorne, I said, my voice perfectly level. Harrison stepped closer, pointing a finger at me. You sent the email begging for a deal, Lauren, he sneered. You knew you could not win a prolonged court battle against us. We are taking half the company, and you are stepping down as primary managing director. Mom and I are taking over the operational finances today. I did not blink. If you're here to review legal documents, we will do it in my executive office. Follow me. I turned my back on them, executing the ultimate display of dominance, and walked toward the glass-walled boardroom adjacent to the lobby. The walls were structurally soundproof but completely transparent. Anyone in the main lobby could see exactly what happened inside, guaranteeing that my guests would witness the impending execution without being disturbed by the noise. I stepped into the room and walked around to my heavy oak desk. As Harrison, Cynthia, and Thorne entered the room, David moved to pull the heavy wooden door shut behind them. No, David, I said, my voice ringing clear and authoritative. Leave the door wide open. Stand right there on the threshold. David nodded and assumed a rigid parade rest position right in the open doorway, an imposing physical reminder that they were entirely on my territory. The open door ensured that my security team could hear every single word spoken legally, verifying the exchange and stripping them of any expectation of privacy. Harrison dropped into one of the leather guest chairs, kicking his boots out in front of him. A smug, victorious smile stretched across his face. He genuinely believed he had won. He thought his desperate legal bluff had actually worked, and that he was seconds away from securing the millions he needed to pay off his predatory lenders. Cynthia remained standing, looking around the immaculate office with greedy, appraising eyes. You really overextended yourself here, Lauren, she said, her voice dripping with toxic maternal condescension. This is far too much responsibility for you to handle alone. You should be thanking your brother for stepping in to save this place from bankruptcy. Your father always knew Harrison had the true head for commercial management. It is a relief we caught this before you ruined the family name. Bradley Thorne pulled a massive stack of legal documents from his briefcase and slapped them down onto my pristine desk with a heavy thud. This is the transfer of equity, Thorne stated, tapping a gold pen against the paper. It grants your brother 50% ownership of the LLC, full access to the corporate accounts, and installs him as co-director. In exchange, we agree to drop the lawsuit regarding your father's mental capacity at the time of the will execution. Sign the bottom line, and we will not freeze your bank accounts this afternoon. I looked down at the stack of papers. Then I looked up at the 3 people who had spent my entire life trying to tear me down. They were practically vibrating with anticipation, ready to snatch my empire right out of my hands. They had absolutely no idea they were standing in a blast zone. I did not touch Thorne's gold pen. I did not even look at the stack of papers he had slammed down in front of me. Instead, I slowly reached out and pushed the entire stack right off the edge of my desk. The heavy documents hit the slate floor with a loud, satisfying thud. The silence in the room became razor sharp. Harrison half rose from his chair, his face contorting in confusion and outrage. Cynthia gasped, taking a step back as if I had just thrown a physical punch. Thorne just stared at the scattered papers on the floor, his professional smirk faltering. I opened my bottom desk drawer and retrieved 3 sleek, matte black folders. I placed them in a perfect, equidistant row on my pristine desk. "I am not signing anything today, Bradley," I said, addressing the lawyer directly. "But since you made the trip all the way from California, I thought it only fair to provide you with some required reading." I slid the first black folder across the desk. Thorne picked it up hesitantly. "That is the corporate operating agreement for Northern Lights Holdings alongside the charter for the irrevocable trust that holds the deed to this land." I explained, my voice perfectly steady. "You will notice that my name is not on the property deed. You will also notice the jurisdictional clauses. This entity is registered in a state that does not recognize out-of-state emergency injunctions regarding corporate ownership. Your threat to freeze my operating accounts in California is legally impossible. You have absolutely no jurisdiction here, and you have zero legal standing to sue me for assets I do not personally hold." Thorne scanned the documents rapidly. The blood drained from his face as he realized his entire legal strategy was built on a bluff that I had just effortlessly called. He looked at Harrison with a sudden sharp glare of realization that his client had brought him into an unwinnable war. Thorne was a predator, but he was not a fool. He knew a bulletproof legal structure when he saw one. Cynthia tried to step in, her voice trembling, but attempting to maintain her aristocratic air. "Lauren, you are being completely unreasonable. We are your family. Your father would be ashamed of you for treating us like this. You need to stop this nonsense and sign the papers." I turned my gaze entirely to her. "Let us talk about my father and the estate, Mother." I slid the second black folder toward her. She did not reach for it. Her hands remained clutched tightly around her designer handbag. Thorne reached over and grabbed the folder instead. He flipped it open, and I watched his eyes widen in genuine horror. "What is that?" Harrison demanded, his voice losing its confident edge. That, I explained, leaning back in my leather chair, is a comprehensive forensic accounting report. It details a series of unauthorized wire transfers totaling $300,000. Those funds were moved from Richard's primary accounts exactly 3 weeks before his will was legally probated. Cynthia's hand flew to her throat. She stumbled backward, bumping into the soundproof glass wall of the office. Through the transparent barrier, the wealthy guests in the lobby watched her dramatic reaction in total silence. "You drained the emergency liquid reserves of a frozen estate," I continued, my voice echoing clearly for my security team to hear. "You routed those funds into a dummy corporation to cover Harrison's margin calls on his catastrophic cryptocurrency losses. You committed federal estate fraud, Mother. It is a felony punishable by up to 10 years in prison. And the drafted criminal complaint sitting in that folder is ready to be filed with the district attorney the moment you leave this room." Thorne physically took a step away from my mother. As a licensed attorney representing a client actively engaged in federal estate fraud was a career-ending liability. "You told me the estate was cleanly probated," Thorne hissed at Cynthia, his professional demeanor entirely shattering. "You told me there were no financial irregularities." Harrison jumped out of his chair, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You are lying. You cannot prove any of that. You are just trying to scare us because you know we have a legitimate claim to this resort." I did not raise my voice. I simply placed my hand on the third and final folder. I slid it directly in front of Harrison. "This one is for you," I said softly. He hesitated, his bravado crumbling before snatching the folder off the desk. He flipped it open. The first page was a copy of the high-interest mezzanine loan he had taken out against the Los Angeles estate. The second page was an official police report. The third page was a filed petition for absolute divorce. "Your wife sends her regards," I told him. Harrison stared at the divorce petition, his eyes darting frantically across the page. The color washed completely out of his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "Naomi would not do this. She does not know about the loans." "Naomi is a brilliant structural engineer," Harrison Firsty stated brutally. "Did you really think an intelligent, highly observant African-American woman who upgrades corporate network security systems for a living was going to let you lock her out of a home office and forge her signature without noticing?" Harrison's breathing became shallow, rapid gasps. He dropped the folder onto the desk as if it had burned him. "Naomi bypassed your pathetic firewalls in 20 minutes. I continued delivering the final devastating blows with clinical precision. She downloaded your entire digital footprint. She found the digital forgery service you used to fake her signature on the secondary mortgage documents. She found the compromised notary stamp you bought from your former business associate. She handed me every single piece of evidence required to put you in a federal penitentiary." I stood up slowly, planting my hands on the desk and leaning toward him. "Naomi left you, Harrison. She is currently in a secure location with a team of elite asset protection attorneys that I personally paid for. The police report in your hand has already been filed regarding the identity theft and wire fraud you committed against your own wife. Your bank is fully aware of the forged loan documents. Your entire life is a crime scene, and the authorities are already taping it off." Thorne scrambled to shove his own legal documents back into his heavy leather briefcase. The predatory lawyer was in full retreat. He wanted absolutely nothing to do with clients who had committed massive federal wire fraud and estate embezzlement. He snapped his briefcase shut and glared at my mother and brother. "I am formally withdrawing my representation, effective immediately," Thorne announced, his voice shaking with furious panic. "Do not ever contact my office again." Thorne turned and practically ran out of my office, brushing past David, who stood perfectly still in the open doorway. The lawyer sprinted across the lobby, desperate to escape the blast radius of my family's impending legal destruction. My mother collapsed into the guest chair Thorne had just vacated. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. The aristocratic facade was completely gone, replaced by the raw, pathetic terror of a woman facing absolute ruin. Harrison stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the divorce papers and the police report. He was hyperventilating, his entire reality disintegrating right in front of his eyes. They had walked into my office expecting to take my empire. Instead, I had systematically dismantled their entire existence in less than 5 minutes. The sound of my mother weeping echoed off the glass walls of my office. It was a hollow, ugly sound entirely devoid of the aristocratic grace she had spent her life cultivating. She sat slumped in the leather guest chair with her face buried in her hands, her designer purse discarded on the floor, next to the fraudulent legal documents her predatory lawyer had abandoned. Harrison was still standing, though his knees were visibly shaking. He held the divorce petition and the police report with a grip so tight his knuckles were stark white. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and bloodshot, searching my face for even a fraction of the submissive sister he used to torment. He found absolutely nothing but cold, impenetrable stone. "Lauren," he choked out, his voice cracking into a pathetic, reedy whisper. "You cannot do this. I will go to prison. I will lose everything. I am your brother. You stopped being my brother the day you sat in that lawyer's office and laughed while our father handed me ruins." I replied, my voice steady and completely devoid of pity. "You stopped being my brother the day you decided my hard work was a resource for you to plunder. You did this to yourself, Harrison. I just handed you the mirror." Cynthia lifted her head, her mascara running down her cheeks in dark, jagged lines. She reached a trembling hand toward my desk. "Lauren, please," she begged, her voice thick with desperation. "We are ruined. The banks are foreclosing on the Los Angeles estate tomorrow. We have nowhere to go. We have no money left. You have to help us. You have this entire resort. You have millions. You can save the family home." I looked at the woman who had spent 34 years treating me like a disposable afterthought. She was actually asking me to bail out the very house my father had weaponized against me. The absolute lack of self-awareness was almost clinical. I opened the top drawer of my desk for the fourth and final time. I pulled out a single pristine manila folder. It was thinner than the others, but it contained the heaviest blow of the entire afternoon. I placed it gently on the center of my desk. "I already saved the house, Mother," I said, my tone perfectly conversational. Cynthia froze. The tears stopped instantly. A sudden, desperate flicker of hope ignited in her red, swollen eyes. She let out a ragged gasp of relief, bringing a hand to her chest. "You paid the bank," she whispered, a frantic smile twitching onto her lips. "Oh, Lauren, thank God. I knew you would not let your father's legacy fall into the hands of strangers. I knew you still cared about this family." Harrison dropped the divorce papers onto the desk, his posture sagging with a massive immediate wave of relief. He let out a shaky, disbelieving laugh, wiping his face with the back of his sleeve. "You paid off the mortgages?" he asked, his voice regaining a tiny fraction of its former arrogance. "You cleared the debt." "I did not pay off your mortgages, Harrison," I corrected, leaning back in my chair and resting my hands on the armrests. "I bought the house." The room went dead silent again. Harrison stared at me, his brow furrowing as his brain struggled to process the distinction. "I bought the house from the bank at a private commercial auction 3 days ago." I explained, articulating every single word with brutal precision. "When my brokers in Los Angeles informed me that your estate was entering pre-foreclosure, I had my acquisitions team monitor the filings. You were drowning in so much toxic predatory debt that the primary lender decided to cut their losses and quietly auction the property to qualified cash buyers before it hit the public market. I formed a blind corporate trust, stepped into the auction, and purchased the entire estate for pennies on the dollar." I slid the manila folder across the desk. Harrison reached out with a trembling hand and flipped it open. Sitting on top of the stack was the recorded property deed. It was completely clear, free of all liens and encumbrances, and the legal owner was listed as a subsidiary of Northern Lights Holdings. "You bought my house," Harrison repeated, his eyes scanning the legal description of the property, recognizing his own address on the paperwork. "It is not your house," I stated, driving the reality into his mind like a nail. "It never really was. It was Dad's house and you used it as a casino. Now, it is my house. I own the driveway you parked your leased sports cars on. I own the pool where you threw your pathetic networking parties. I literally own the roof you were just kicked out from under." Cynthia stood up, her hands gripping the edge of my desk. Her face was a mask of absolute bewilderment. "But Lauren, if you own the house, then we can stay. We can keep the estate in the family. You can just transfer the deed back to us, and we can start over." The sheer, bottomless depth of her entitlement was staggering. She was standing in a room surrounded by evidence of her own federal crimes, and she was still asking me for a $4 million handout. "You are not staying in my house, Mother," I said, leaning forward and meeting her desperate gaze with absolute zero tolerance. "I did not buy that property out of some misplaced sense of family loyalty or nostalgia. I bought it because it was a distressed asset in a high-value neighborhood, and I am a commercial real estate developer. It is a rental investment. Nothing more." Harrison stumbled backward, hitting the glass wall of the office just as our mother had done minutes earlier. "You are evicting us," he asked, the reality finally truly crushing him. "You are throwing your own mother out onto the street." "I am not throwing anyone anywhere," I replied, my voice ringing with cold, hard logic. "The bank already threw you out, Harrison. You defaulted on your loans. You lost the property. I simply purchased an empty, foreclosed asset. In fact, I already have a specialized contracting team scheduled to arrive at the property on Monday morning. They're going to completely gut the interior, strip away every single piece of that tacky manufactured aesthetic you installed, and renovate the space for high-end corporate leasing. I am going to rent the house out to actual successful people who can afford to pay their bills." Harrison slid down the glass wall, his legs completely giving out beneath him. He hit the slate floor, pulling his knees to his chest, his breath coming in ragged, hyperventilating wheezes. He was a broken, empty shell of a man. He had walked into my lobby demanding half of my empire. In return, I had handed him his wife's divorce papers, the police report for his federal crimes, and the deed to the only home he had left. He had absolutely nothing. He was homeless, wifeless, facing imminent criminal charges, and standing on a floor paid for by the sister he had spent a lifetime treating like garbage. Cynthia looked down at her son completely broken on the floor of my office. She looked at the fraud complaints sitting on my desk, detailing her own embezzlement. She looked at the deed to the Los Angeles estate, the physical manifestation of her failed maternal strategy. The golden child was bankrupt and facing prison. The scapegoat was a multimillionaire holding all the keys. The toxic hierarchy she had spent 34 years maintaining had been completely violently obliterated. I sat behind my desk watching the two of them process their absolute destruction. I felt no pity. I felt no guilt. I had simply allowed them to suffer the exact consequences of their own actions. They had built a house of cards on a foundation of lies, and I had just opened the door and let the winter wind blow it all away. Cynthia stood up, abandoning her designer bag on the polished slate floor. She moved toward the edge of my heavy oak desk, her hands reaching out in a trembling, pleading gesture. The tears streaming down her face were no longer calculated. They were the visceral, messy tears of a woman who saw the gates of a federal prison opening before her. She looked at the drafted fraud complaint sitting next to the deed of the Los Angeles estate. The $300,000 she had embezzled from my father's frozen accounts had finally caught up to her. "Lauren, listen to me," Cynthia begged, her voice cracking into a high, desperate pitch. "You cannot file those charges. You cannot send your own mother to prison. I did what I had to do to protect your brother. He was in trouble and I was trying to hold the family together. We are family, Lauren. We share the same blood. You cannot destroy us over money." I sat back in my leather chair, watching her play the absolute last card she had left. For 34 years, she had weaponized the concept of family to demand my compliance. She had used our bloodline as an excuse to overlook Harrison's incompetence and to demand my silent submission. Now she was trying to use it as an invisible shield against federal embezzlement charges. "You did not protect the family," I replied, my voice slicing through the warm air of the office with absolute freezing precision. "You protected your own ego. You could not stomach the idea that your golden child was a complete financial disaster, so you stole from a dead man's estate to cover his gambling debts. You committed a felony to buy an illusion." "I am your mother," she sobbed, pressing her hands flat against the glass of the desktop. "I gave you life. I raised you. You owe me some grace. Please, Lauren, just tear up those papers. We will leave. We will never bother you again. Just let me walk away from this." I looked down at the woman who had called me just days ago, demanding I surrender my entire livelihood to cover her son's failures. I remembered the cold, arrogant tone she had used when she gave me an ultimatum to abandon my property. The staggering hypocrisy of her current begging washed over me, leaving absolutely nothing but cold resolve. "Family doesn't steal," I stated, the words falling like heavy stones between us. "Family doesn't forge loan documents against their wives. Family doesn't embezzle from probate accounts. And family certainly doesn't hire predatory lawyers to gaslight their daughters out of their rightful inheritance." I stood up, adjusting the cuffs of my tailored blazer, and looked directly into her panicked, tear-filled eyes. I leaned forward, resting my fingertips on the desk. "When you called me earlier this week," I continued, "you gave me exactly 96 hours to surrender my empire to you. I am going to be far more generous with my timeline." I glanced at the sleek, minimalist clock sitting on the corner of my desk. "You have exactly 96 seconds to get off my property before my security team has you formally arrested for criminal trespassing." Cynthia let out a sharp, devastated gasp, stumbling backward as if the air had been knocked from her lungs. She looked at me, searching for any trace of the obedient daughter she thought she knew, but she found nothing but an impenetrable fortress. "David," I commanded, not breaking eye contact with my mother. David stepped immediately through the open doorway, his presence filling the space with sudden impending action. "Yes, ma'am." "Escort these two individuals off the premises immediately," I instructed. "If their vehicle is not off the heated driveway before the timer expires, lock the main gates and call the county sheriff." "Press full charges." "Understood," David replied. He gestured to the two broad-shouldered security guards waiting in the lobby. They moved in with flawless mechanical efficiency. Harrison was still curled on the floor, his mind completely broken by the reality of his divorce, his impending fraud charges, and his total financial ruin. The guards did not ask him to stand. They simply reached down, grabbed him by the arms, and hoisted his dead weight off the slate floor. Harrison groaned, his legs stumbling beneath him, completely stripped of the arrogant swagger he had walked in with. He looked hollow, a pathetic shell being dragged out of a kingdom he had tried to conquer. David approached Cynthia, keeping a polite but unyielding professional distance. "Ma'am, it is time to leave. Walk toward the doors." Cynthia scrambled to pick up her designer handbag from the floor, her hands shaking so violently she dropped it twice. She looked at Harrison being half carried by the guards, and then she looked back at me. She opened her mouth to speak, to try one last desperate plea, but David stepped squarely into her line of sight, physically blocking her from me. "Move," David ordered, his voice brooking zero debate. They were marched out of my executive office and into the grand lobby. The transition from the private soundproof room to the public space was jarring. The lobby was still occupied by my high-net-worth guests, tech executives and venture capitalists, who were quietly sipping their artisan cocktails by the roaring stone fireplace. The entire room fell into absolute deafening silence. The guests watched as the supposed heirs to my father's legacy were humiliatingly herded across the hand-woven rugs. Cynthia kept her head down, her face burning with profound, inescapable shame. She was acutely aware of the wealthy, influential people witnessing her total degradation. She had spent her entire life trying to climb the social ladder, desperate to be seen as an elite aristocrat. Now she was being publicly ejected like a common criminal from a luxury resort owned by the daughter she had deemed worthless. Harrison did not even try to hide his face. He stared blankly ahead as the guards marched him through the heavy glass front doors. The freezing Minnesota wind immediately bit into them, whipping Cynthia's hair across her tear-stained face. I walked out of my office and stood at the glass railing of the interior balcony, watching the execution of my orders from above. The guards pushed Harrison toward his rented Jeep, shoving him against the passenger door. Cynthia scrambled into the driver's seat, her hands fumbling frantically with the keys. She knew I was not bluffing about the sheriff. She knew the 96 seconds were rapidly ticking away. The Jeep's engine roared to life. Cynthia threw the vehicle into gear, the tires briefly spinning on the heated pavement before catching traction. The heavy matte black security gates at the end of the driveway began to slowly glide open, preparing to expel them into the frozen wilderness. I watched the vehicle speed down the winding road, disappearing behind the thick wall of snow-covered evergreens. The lobby beneath me slowly returned to its quiet, sophisticated murmur, my staff smoothly transitioning back to their flawless service routines, as if the disruption had never occurred. The toxic infection that had plagued my entire existence had been surgically and permanently removed. I remained standing at the glass railing of the interior balcony for several long minutes, absorbing the profound silence that had settled over my empire. The frantic, desperate energy that my mother and brother had dragged into my lobby was completely gone. In its place was the steady, humming rhythm of extreme luxury. The fire crackled in the massive stone hearth. The high-net-worth guests conversed in low, uninterrupted tones. My security team resumed their invisible, watchful posts. The breach had been sealed. I turned and walked back into my executive office. The fraudulent transfer documents Bradley Thorne had slammed onto my desk were still scattered across the slate floor. I did not bend down to pick them up. I simply called for my assistant to bring a commercial shredder. As the steel blades chewed through the heavy legal paper, reducing their predatory demands to meaningless confetti, I sat down at my desk and opened a secure communication channel to Charles. "Execute it all," I instructed, my voice perfectly calm. "Send the files." The fallout that followed over the next several months was absolute and merciless. When Naomi's legal team filed the divorce petition in Los Angeles, they did not just request a standard dissolution of marriage. They attached the pristine digital forensics, proving Harrison had committed federal wire fraud and identity theft. The private equity firm that held the mezzanine loan on the Los Angeles estate was immediately alerted to the forgery. Because the loan had been secured under fraudulent pretenses, the bank escalated the matter directly to federal authorities. Harrison did not just face bankruptcy, he faced a coordinated legal execution. The district attorney indicted him on multiple counts of fraud and grand theft. Stripped of his home, his wife, and his liquid capital, he had absolutely no resources to hire a competent defense attorney. He was forced to rely on an overworked public defender to navigate a labyrinth of federal charges. The arrogant golden child who had spent his entire life expecting to be bailed out was finally forced to stand entirely alone in front of a judge who cared absolutely nothing about his family name. Cynthia's destruction was equally absolute, though hers played out in the probate courts and the ruthless circles of high society. The moment Charles filed the formal complaint regarding the $300,000 she had embezzled from my father's frozen estate, the probate judge ordered an immediate comprehensive audit of her finances. Her remaining personal accounts were frozen. The court demanded full restitution of the stolen funds coupled with aggressive financial penalties. To avoid an immediate prison sentence, my mother was forced to liquidate every single asset she had hoarded over the years. She sold her jewelry, her designer wardrobes, and the luxury vehicles my father had purchased for her. It was not enough. She was forced to declare total personal bankruptcy. But the financial ruin was secondary to the social annihilation. In the affluent California neighborhoods, she prized above all else reputation as currency. When the details of her embezzlement and her attempt to extort her own daughter became public knowledge, her social circle slammed their doors shut. She was excised from her country clubs, removed from her charity boards, and entirely isolated. She had sacrificed everything to maintain an illusion of superiority, and she was left with absolutely nothing. While their world burned to ash, my empire continued to ascend into the stratosphere. The Aurora Haven expanded its operations, integrating 3 new luxury eco-pavilions to meet the overwhelming market demand. The tech company executives who had witnessed the altercation in my lobby did not view it as a scandal. They saw a founder who possessed the absolute ruthless capability to protect her assets. My reputation in the commercial development sector became legendary. I was no longer just a hospitality developer. I was an impenetrable fortress. I purchased the remaining commercial plots adjacent to the state park, securing a complete unassailable monopoly over the region's luxury ecotourism. The Los Angeles estate I had purchased from the bank was gutted, stripped of Harrison's tacky aesthetic, and leased to a high-profile entertainment executive, generating a massive stream of passive income. Every asset my family had tried to use against me had been repurposed to fuel my own continuous growth. 6 months after they were escorted off my property, I found myself standing on the private cantilevered balcony of my executive suite. It was late evening, and the brutal Minnesota winter had transformed the landscape into a vast, silent ocean of pristine white and deep shadow. The air was razor-sharp and biting, but the heated stone beneath my feet kept the cold at bay. I held a crystal flute of vintage champagne, watching the sky above the frozen lake transition into a spectacular canvas. Ribbons of vibrant emerald green and deep violet began to pulse across the darkness, the aurora borealis putting on a private display over the sanctuary I had built from absolute ruins. I thought about the young woman who had sat in that suffocating lawyer's office 3 years ago, accepting the deed to a rotting fishing camp, while her family openly mocked her. I thought about the fear and the isolation I had felt driving up that icy road for the first time. I searched my heart for any lingering trace of grief for the mother and brother I had permanently severed from my life. I found absolutely none. There was no sadness. There was no regret. There was only the profound, quiet peace of absolute independence. The toxic hierarchy that had defined my childhood had been dismantled brick by brick, and the people who had tried to build their success on my subjugation were drowning in the consequences of their own arrogance. They had demanded my surrender. I had engineered their destruction. I raised my glass to the dancing lights in the northern sky. I was entirely self-sufficient, financially invincible, and completely free. The borders of my life were secure, and my boundaries were impenetrable. I took a slow, satisfying sip of the champagne, listening to the total, uninterrupted silence of my empire.